Hello and welcome to yet another video. This is the fourth episode of the story, and when Naruto's father met his mother, his first thought was that a village out there must be missing its idiot. This story is from Silver Shine. Please support him, her. Please like and subscribe to show your support. Let's get the show started. The same blue sky was hanging over Konoha as when he'd left. It seemed unusually bright, but that was most likely because he'd spent the last 3 years living on the mist-covered shores of the continent where the sun only broke through the clouds a couple of hours for a few days at the height of summer. Minato had never realized how dry and warm the climate was in his native village. He felt like Woodlouse who'd crawled out from beneath a rock. "Sign in, please," said the bored-looking guard at the gate. Minato didn't remember this procedure, but he hefted his backpack onto one shoulder and accepted the clipboard he was handed. There were at least 30 other names signed under today's date, and he scanned them briefly, recognizing a few and making a mental note to check up on them. As he signed his own name at the bottom, the gatekeeper's attitude suddenly changed. "Namikaze Minato," he read out, evidently very good at reading upside down. "We just got the news the other day. Everyone will be so excited to see you back. It's an honor." Minato looked at him stolidly. "What is?" To meet the one who took down General Akuse. They say you won the war pretty much single-handedly." "Not really," Minato said, because that was a horrible exaggeration. If he'd fought this war alone he would have died 3 years ago and Konoha would have been overrun by now. Akuse's death may have been a monumental victory, but the fighting in the following weeks had been more vicious and frantic than ever before, and it was only through daily waves of endless assaults that Kiri had been driven back into the water country. By no means did Minato want to take credit for something dozens of his friends had died fighting for. It had been fun when he'd returned with Akuse's sword, to be toasted and cheered, but he hadn't really thought the hero worship would last. He hadn't thought he would have to endure it on the other side of the country. "I heard you're being promoted, is that why you're back?" "No," Minato said simply. "My father died." "Oh. I'm sorry." Minato smiled vaguely, always left bemused by people's immediate reaction to apologize to him as if his loss was their fault. He handed back the clipboard and went on his way, deciding to head home and drop off his supplies and equipment before even beginning to think about what to do next. The first person he bumped into along the way was Ai's mother. She gave a cry of delight and hurried over to pinch his cheeks and remark about how tall and handsome he'd grown. She asked why her favorite customer hadn't stopped by the ice cream parlor since his return, and he informed her that he hadn't even unpacked yet, to which she asked him how long he planned to stay. Minato told her he supposed it would be until after the funeral. "Funeral?" she echoed, dismayed. "My father," he said. "Oh, Minato, I didn't know," she said, looking pitying. "I'm so sorry." There it was again. After promising he would stop by her parlor as soon as possible, he continued on his way home. On his street, his neighbors recognized him. Like Ai's mother, they made exclamations about his height and then gave him sad smiles as they apologized about his father. They had all heard about it, perhaps well before he had, and they were past the stage of surprise and onto the stage of morbid curiosity. They asked him how it had happened. Minato didn't know. He shook them off eventually and made it to his front door. It seemed smaller than he remembered. In fact, everything looked smaller, except for the plants and the trees which had grown about as much as he had. When Minato let himself into his own home, he wondered if he'd made a mistake, for he knew at once that this was where his father had died. He could smell it. After killing more people than he could count and witnessing more bloated waterlogged corpses than he'd ever needed to see, he knew what death smelled like. It was a stench that had lodged in the back of his throat a long time ago that would never truly leave him. It was there for good, and that was the price you paid for a job like this. But stepping into this house, Minato was reminded immediately of the human abattoir in the Kiri outpost. The smell, the decay, the flies. His shoulder hit the doorframe. Only then did he realize he was stumbling backwards, out of the house and down the steps. It had been a mistake. He shouldn't have come here. Shouldn't have naively assumed walking in the door would be as easy as he remembered. He took his bags and he kept walking, away from his house and towards the heart of the village. He had no idea where he was going other than some pale realization that he was retreading a beaten path he'd often taken when he was younger. It took him as far as the bridge where he'd so many afternoons throwing stones in the river with his friends. He stopped and sat down on his backpack to watch the ripples of the water current, trying to organize himself. He had to find accommodation, something cheap that wouldn't overtax his rather limited budget. Then he'd have to go down to the morgue, or visit the village undertaker, whichever dealt with whatever came next. Minato pressed his fingers into his eyes and rubbed. Then what did he do after that? Oh, look, I've found a little yellow flash. Minato lifted his head and looked up. He very nearly recoiled when he met the yellow-eyed gaze of a face even more pasty than his own. Just what he needed. Running into Orochimaru on his first day back. Would you quit it? Tsunade said, walking past them without pause. Stop tormenting him, he's just a kid. As scary as this woman was on the best of days, she wasn't nearly half as scary as the snakeman, so Minato quickly jumped to his feet and called out to her before she strode out of earshot. Tsunadesima, if you're here, does that mean Jiraiya's not here, kid, she said, turning to him with a hand on her hip. And she certainly could fill a uniform better than most people. Then, still in the rain country, she interrupted. Trust Jiraiya, the war ends and everyone's finally free to come home, but he can't resist that one last project. What? Orphans, Orochimaru said with distaste. He uncovered a couple of urchins and decided to stay behind to rear them. I hope you don't mind, but your sensei has new students now. I guess he was bored with the old ones. Stop it, Tsunade sighed, annoyed. Orphans? Students? Why had Minato not heard about this? When is he coming home? Coming home? What makes you think he is? Orochimaru smiled nastily and drifted on his way. Tsunade shot Minato a faintly annoyed look, as if her exasperation with her teammate was his fault, before following after the slithery bastard. Minato remained stiff in their wake, fiercely mixed feelings churning in his chest. Looking after orphans, that was pretty noble and kind-hearted, and he wouldn't expect any less of Jiraiya Sensei. On the other hand, this was his sensei, and who knew how long such a detour would take him out of the village? Weeks? Months? Years? He sagged down onto his backpack, head in his arms. If Jiraiya were here, he'd know what to do and say. He'd probably let Minato crash in his spare room for a few nights and help him sort through the pain of making funeral arrangements. But while he should have been there, he was off building an orphanage. He shouldn't be churlish. In all likeliness, the needs of orphans were greater than his own. He would have felt a whole lot better, however, if Jiraiya had been here waiting for him. A new shadow fell over him, one cast by an umbrella judging by its shape on the ground. 2 feet in black plimsolls stepped into view beneath his arms. Someone with very neat ankles was leaning over him. You all right? The girl asked. And Minato, very used to being approached by strange girls and for whom the novelty had worn off long ago, sighed and said heavily, I'm fine. Really, who would put up an umbrella on such a wonderfully sunny day? Scorched, the plimsolls took a step back, then they continued on their way. Minato lifted his chin to watch her, surprised that she'd given up so quickly. Had his tone been too harsh? Besides, she looked a little strange, all dressed in black with a black umbrella over one shoulder. As such he couldn't see her head, but he doubted he knew anyone as weird as that anyway. Minato. It's you, it's really you. Konoha's newly styled yellow flash turned only just in time to catch the girl that might have bulldozed anyone with slightly poorer reflexes into the wall behind him. He couldn't rule out the possibility that this was what AI had been trying to do, but she seemed so happy to see him that he could quite easily forget all those years of passive abuse he'd suffered at her hands. He smiled back and accepted her enormous bear hug. "Mom said you were back," she told him, pulling away enough to let him see that she wasn't alone. The old gang was here too, giving him more restrained gestures of welcome that were no less pleased. There was Yamanaka Inoichi, looking taller and far more solid around the jaw than he remembered. Akimichi Chuza was twice as large in all directions, while Saburo had managed to grow longer and thinner but still retain his round face that had always made him look almost as heavy as Chuza. Some others were there too: Chi-Chi, Aburame Shibi, Inazuka Tsum, and a couple of faces he had either never seen or didn't recall. The change in AI struck him as most stark, however. When he had left, she'd easily been the tallest in their team, save for Jiraiya, but now she barely came up to his shoulder. Had she shrunk? Or had he really grown that much? She was still thin, though, so much so that she felt like a fragile bird in his arms. "You've been making quite a name for yourself," she remarked. "Did you just sneak back into town?" Inoichi asked. "I was so sure the only way you would be returning would be on the back of a bejeweled elephant, surrounded by a marching parade of glittering swans and a brass band." "Not quite," Minato admitted with a wry grin. "What are you doing back?" Inoichi scrutinized him. "I didn't think they were pulling people out yet." "Is Shikaku with you?" "Shikaku's still at the border," Minato said, looking around uneasily at all the people around him. He didn't really want to tell Cher the reason for his return with something that resembled an audience. "I'm just here to take care of some stuff." "His dad died," AI said, who must have heard it from her mother. Minato looked at her flatly, trying hard to keep the sudden surge of dislike for her showing on his face. "Sorry to hear that, man," Inoichi murmured like everyone else. "Was it in the war?" No," Minato said awkwardly, looking for a change of subject. "How've you guys been while I was gone? Tell me what's been happening." This was a much more pleasant topic for everyone, and as Minato made his way further into town in the general direction of the inns and travel lodges, his old friends accompanied him, exuberantly updating him on the latest of everyone relevant. Quite a lot seemed to have happened and no one was quite the same as he remembered. Though he had to admit, he had not thought about his friends much since leaving 3 years ago. "So then we were all banned from the izakaya, which I still maintain was an overreaction. The stains would have come out with a little lemon juice." Inoichi finished, and leaned towards Minato as they walked. "But the important question is, what's been happening to you, Minato?" "I heard you went to a brothel," said Chuza. "Nearly got killed by a prostitute," agreed Chi-Chi. "I heard it was a male prostitute," I mused. "And what about this General Aku's business?" Inoichi demanded. "How the hell did you manage to kill one of the 7 swordsmen?" Tsum spluttered. Minato stopped and looked around at the eager faces looking back at him. A lot of questions had been fired just now, and he didn't really desire to answer any of them. Since he didn't really have a choice, he went with the safest bet. "I stabbed him." "The prostitute or General Aku's?" Inoichi pressed. Aku's." This was met with jeers of disbelief. "No one just walks into a Kiri stronghold and stabs a swordsman," I said contemptuously. "It was a little more complicated than that," Minato told her. "But it's true though, right? You did kill him? That's why everyone's calling you the Yellow Flash now, like you're some kind of legendary nin?" Inoichi asked. Minato just nodded. "Bloody hell," he whispered. "Aku's was the strongest in his village, probably stronger than the Mizukage, even," Chi-Chi said. "Does this mean Minato's about on the same level as Hokage?" They all looked at each other, and then back at him with a quivering kind of awe. Minato didn't like it. The way people had looked at him ever since defeating Accuse always made him uneasy, especially when they were people he had thought considered him as just another peer even if he was especially talented. So, since you were banned from the izakaya, what do you guys do for fun around here? He asked them, hoping to shake some of that creepy reverence out of their expressions. We mostly throw stones at little children and genin, Inoichi said. Right. Minato nodded again. Anything else to do? A strange leer spread over Inoichi's face. Well, there's always Uzumaki. Oh, grow up, Ai snapped. Don't be disgusting, Chi-Chi sneered. Men, intoned Sum flatly. Everyone else, who were men, just smirked. Minato didn't get it. I don't get it. Was this some kind of new teasing they devised? Minato had hoped that after 3 years people like Inoichi would eventually get bored of bullying Kushina. What's to get? Inoichi shrugged. Just watch what you say, Chuza warned his teammate. Sarutobi would slug you for that. The Hokage? Minato's eyes widened. He found it hard to imagine the old man slugging anyone. No, his nephew, said Inoichi. The Hokage's nephew? Why did that sound familiar? Forget Sarutobi, Chuza said. Kushina would kill you. You're joking. She wouldn't hurt a fly, Inoichi scoffed. You know she was on the waterfall border for a year but she never once killed anyone. All this tough talk from her is completely empty. Was she in a supplementary unit? Minato asked, confused. No, that's the thing. She was out on the battlefield, same as anyone else, but her unit claims she never killed anyone. Ai made a derisive sound. Weakling. I like it, Inoichi said, looking to the sky. She descends like an angel of mercy, perfectly savage and able to take your life, but she chooses not to because inside she is pure goodness. No wonder Waterfall surrendered so quickly and she won the heart of her captain. Everywhere she goes, people fall to her feet, begging forgiveness and permission to bask in her beauty for just a few moments. Minato stared at him. What? Ignore him, Chuza grunted, shaking his head. He's an idiot. I'm serious. Inoichi protested. Give it up, Inoichi. You're up against a Jonin captain who's related to the Hokage and she doesn't even like you, so what hope do you have? His teammate shook his head. Give it up. Can we talk about something other than Kushina, for once? Ai growled. This was clearly something she was frequently frustrated by. You're just jealous because she actually has tits, Inoichi said cruelly. Before Ai could explode, Minato pointed out, you used to tease Kushina about that. Inoichi put a hand over his heart. Youthful idiocy, my friend. I was blind but now I see what you saw in her. Minato was still nonplussed. All he'd seen in Kushina was her supreme awkwardness and her grubby, knobbly knees. He'd liked her all the same, but he didn't understand if it was a new form of abuse Inoichi was trying out by singing her wildly exaggerated praises or genuine adoration. Why don't you just ask her out? Chi-Chi asked. One does not date the angel of mercy. Inoichi despaired. You worship her from afar, and occasionally grope her from behind. Minato sucked in a breath. If you've been harassing Kushina, he cut himself off. Everyone held their breath. Inoichi looked a little worried. What? I think I'll get quite angry, Minato said honestly. Make that a Jonin captain and the yellow flash, Chuza muttered. No chance, Inoichi. Inoichi pouted. That's not fair, Minato's totally asexual. Isn't that right, Minato? Kushina's just your beard? Right? You're not actually interested in her, are you? Minato smiled slightly and shook his head. You'd have to be pretty touched in the head to be interested in Kushina, he said, enjoying Inoichi's spluttered denial. I dare you to say that to Sarutobi's face, he said. Who is Sarutobi? Minato asked, narrowing his eyes slightly. What is he to Kushina? Why don't you ask her yourself? Inoichi said, and suddenly began waving at someone, behind Minato. Hey! Kushina! My darling, over here. Minato turned quickly, and wondered why his heart had decided to beat so hard at the thought he was moments away from seeing Kushina again. He searched the crowds of early afternoon shoppers, waiting to see that short, red-haired girl in the grubby culottes and overlarge sweater appear. She always stood out like a sore thumb. But this time as he hunted the rows of market stalls, he saw no one familiar. Hey, she's ignoring me, Inoichi sighed, lowering his hand. Why wouldn't she? Chi-Chi rebuked. Just where were they looking? They all seemed to be able to see her, but no matter how many times Minato's eyes darted between them and the crowds, trying to follow their gaze, all he saw was a mass of strangers. Oi, Uzumaki! Inoichi shouted to the apparently invisible girl. Look who finally decided to come home from the war. Someone turned and detached from the herd. So she'd been browsing that flower stall all along? Minato's mouth went a little dry, as it usually did when he anticipated one of Danzu's horrible protracted lectures. He didn't know why he should react that way, as if all his insides were threatening to turn to liquid. It was only Kushina, someone he knew better than most people alive, and she wasn't scary. Except he didn't know the girl coming towards them. Not in the slightest. Where was his grubby-faced urchin? The one who was perpetually smudged with dirt and sweat and refused to make the acquaintance of a hairbrush? The one who wiped her nose on her sleeves? The one who wore the same worn clothes every day for 2 weeks before she might consent to washing them? The one with the frightening stare? The girl coming toward them only resembled her in the vaguest possible sense. Her clothes were clean for a start, and sleek and black. She wore leggings and a plain black sheath dress that left her arms bare and, surprisingly shapely, he'd never noticed that before. The hair that had last been forming a rough-hewn mane somewhere around her chin now fell in poker-straight lines down past her shoulders, though most of it seemed to be heaped up in a bun behind her. Remarkably, her face was spotless. Not a speck of dirt to be seen anyway. Her complexion was about as close to perfection as some girls vied for, though this might have been because on a brilliantly hot, sunny day, she'd had the foresight to bring an umbrella to protect her fair, perfect skin. Ah! Now he knew why she was scowling at him in that manner that was perhaps the only familiar thing about her. It's the yellow flasher, isn't it? She said, stopping a few meters away. Some of those behind him actually had the nerve to giggle, though for once it was not at Kushina's expense. It was his own. You must spare him your brutal wit, Uzumaki, Inoichi scolded her. Minato can slay a man 100 different ways, but he is a sensitive soul, easily fooled and easily injured. Minato opened his mouth to deny that, but Kushina cut across him. Easily fooled and easily injured sounds quite like a lot of other people I know, she said, glaring at Inoichi, who colored. I have no idea what you mean. She probably means that time you tried to stick certain parts of your body through her letterbox, Chuza reminded him. Inoichi. Minato gasped. He was very close to making good on his threat to get angry. Good thing he got the wrong house, Chuza added. Inoichi leapt for a diversion. What lovely lupins you have there, Uzumaki, he cried, gesturing to the bunch of cream-colored flowers in Kushina's hand that, as far as Minato was concerned, looked like any other flower. You should have asked me before you bought them, Hana gives me a special discount. You know. If Hana thought you were buying flowers for another girl, that discount would disappear pretty quick, I retorted. I can pay for my own flowers, thank you, Kushina said sharply, which in itself surprised Minato. When he'd left, she could barely afford her own food. To think she had spare money on frivolities like lupins. You look like you're in mourning with that get-up, Inoichi said, gesturing to her flowers and her black clothes. Minato took it as a sign that she at least didn't normally dress like this. I am, she answered, twirling the umbrella in a slow circle behind her. Mikoto is getting married to Fugueface. Despite my best efforts, they plan to tie the knot and have threatened to ban me from the ceremony. Another one bites the dust, Uzumaki? Inoichi said, looking like he was trying hard to suppress laughter. She glared at him. You wouldn't understand. I've lost my best friend to a puffer fish. Ah. Well, then Minato is your man. Inoichi clapped his hand on said boy's back. He is a world-renowned slayer of pufferfish, aren't you? Minato opened his mouth. I'll be fine, thank you, she said shortly. If that's all you wanted, I have things to get done today. No, wait, Uzumaki, Inoichi called, making her pause. I've been meaning to ask. She waited. Spit or swallow? As laughter exploded behind him, Minato felt the limit of his temper edging closer again. By then he thought he understood the answer to whether or not Inoichi abhorred Kushina or adored her. It was a little of both. Kushina didn't seem surprised. I bite, she snapped, and promptly turned, very nearly knocking everyone's eyes out with her umbrella, and stormed away. I'll be sure to give Sarutobi my sympathies the next time I see him. Inoichi crowed after her, much to AI's newfound amusement. That wasn't funny, Minato said, suddenly angry that he was watching his former best friend walk away, and that they had managed to meet and not say a single word to one another. His other friends were to blame for that. It's just a bit of fun, Minato, Inoichi said. For you, he pointed out. I thought you might have matured a little in the last couple of years, but you're just the same, making fun of someone because you can't handle the fact you fancy her. What? Inoichi was shocked, speechless for once. It's just a joke, man, I don't really fancy, and you can stop laughing, Minato said to AI, who immediately stopped. You could have grown out of your petty prejudices, but you've clung to them instead for no reason I can see. You haven't changed at all. You have, she retorted, face white with anger. Since when did you become an arrogant jerk who felt entitled to pass judgment on people? Minato ignored her, instead looking to Chuza. Chuza noticed this and immediately threw up his hands. Hey, I like Kushina, he said quickly. Don't shout at me. I'm not shouting. Minato frowned and shifted the shoulder strap of his bag. I'm just saying. I didn't expect this from you guys. Oh, go screw yourself, you jumped-up bastard, AI said savagely, and stormed away in the opposite direction from Kushina. Minato half wondered if she'd meant that as a general insult, or had chosen it very specifically. Either way he wasn't hurt, and he turned away. I'll see you later, guys, he said, heading off quickly in pursuit of Kushina. See ya, Inoichi drawled unenthusiastically after him. Now that he knew Kushina was the one with the umbrella, she was very easy to spot cutting through the crowds in the distance. Minato wove his way quickly up the busy street, dodging elbows and the occasional cabbage thrust at his face by overzealous sellers. He caught up with her at the crest of the hill and drew up alongside her, wary of the sharp spokes in her umbrella. She looked at him, unsurprised, but she wasn't scowling anymore at least. You were on the bridge this morning, he said, because he couldn't think of anything else to say. Yes, and a right rude idiot you were. I didn't think it could possibly be you. She tapped the flowers against her mouth. It was the same mouth as he remembered, but those lips seemed fuller. Prettier. She seemed to know how to purse them just right to draw his attention. She noticed him staring and frowned. You look great, he gushed helplessly. She looked back blankly. At least her propensity to never trust a compliment was still intact. You look well-travelled, she responded diplomatically. I stink, I know, he sighed. But are you wearing perfume? She coughed. It's Mikoto's, she said quickly. She squirts it on me before I can run out the door, I can't help it. The lady protested too much, Minato thought. He didn't mind if Kushina liked to wear perfume, though it further contradicted his memory of a child who scorned any other girl who so much as looked at a bottle of deodorant. Something else about her comment caught his attention, however. Are you living with Mikoto? She nodded. So you moved out of the center? They can't keep you forever, she told him. Me and Mikoto shared rent on a new place because she didn't want to stay in the Uchiha compound. She'll be moving back there once she marries though. You guys are getting along pretty well then? She's my best friend, Kushina repeated. They lapsed into silence as they walked. Perhaps like him she was remembering a time when they had considered each other best friends? Or perhaps she was too busy fretting about the wedding. As they moved down a street dominated by tall buildings, shadows fell heavily across the street. Kushina closed her umbrella and tapped it against the ground beside her as she walked. Every now and then they passed a gap in the buildings and a shaft of sunlight would hit her hair. Minato was fascinated. He had never seen so many shades of red in his life. But eventually he had to ask the pressing question. Where are we going? I'm going home to put these in water, she said pointedly. I don't know where you're going. She wasn't inviting him along. I don't know where I'm going either, he admitted. Have you even been home yet? She asked. He shook his head hesitantly, not wanting to admit he'd been and gone, too afraid by specters to stay. You should go home then, she said. Take a shower, talk to your father and stuff. He got pretty lonely while you were away. He says you never wrote. Minato stopped. Her words had chased the air out of his lungs and left him as if he was standing in the doorway of his home again. Kushina spoke so casually of his father, as if he was still alive, which couldn't have cut through him more effectively to remind Minato that he was not. He swallowed hard, wondering if there was a wall nearby he could lean against to collect himself. Kushina looked at him curiously. What's the matter? You talked to my father? A few times, yes, she said. Did he throw anything at you? No, she said, shaking her head. Look, maybe I should walk you home. You don't look very well. I'm fine, he said quickly, in very much the same tone he'd used on the bridge earlier that had made her recoil. This time she looked at him with a faint frown. I'll walk you home, I'm not going home, he told her. I plan to just rent a room a couple of days. I won't be staying here long. Her frown deepened ever so slightly. Okay, where are you staying? I don't know yet. What's your budget? He scrounged around in his pocket and produced a couple of coins. He looked at Kushina, awaiting her judgment, since he suspected she knew more about the value of money than he did after spending 3 years out on the border where the most highly prized commodity was fabric softener. This is it, she pointed to his small change. This won't get you very far. Where's the rest? He shrugged. I'm not lending you money, she warned. Wasn't going to ask, he said defensively. The last person he'd attempt to scrounge money from was Kushina. I have more but? It's at home. And he felt cold just thinking of that house. Then you better run home and get it, she said expectantly, waiting for him to do just that. He stayed fixed in place. Kushina tapped her umbrella against the cobbled street. You don't want to go home, do you? Rather than admit it by shaking his head, he just frowned at himself and his own silly weakness. I can go get it for you, if you like, she said. I'm sure your father won't mind. No, he said quickly, wincing. I'm a big boy, I can do it. Do you want me to come with you? He thought about it for a long moment. He didn't really want to take her to that place, but he didn't really want to say goodbye just yet either. Also, she seemed to sense that he needed the moral support. He knew it too, so he nodded his assent and she fell into step beside him as they started on their way back towards Minato's house. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'm sure you'd do the same for me," she said, a little impersonally, as if he was nothing more than a casual acquaintance to whom could be granted the occasional favor. He supposed that, these days, that's what they really were to each other. He was unfamiliar with the girl next to him. She had been to war, she had moved into a new place with a friend, and appeared to have a boyfriend he knew nothing about. What she thought about these things, what she thought of Minato, was a mystery to him. Out in the sunlight, she drew up her umbrella again. "I burn easily," she said to him when he stared quizzically. "Ah," he said, turning his face to the sky. "I just go as brown as a berry." "Are berries brown?" she asked. "Some are, I guess." "You don't look very brown right now," she said, peering at him. "I think you'll burn too, if you're not careful." "Maybe I can share your umbrella," he joked. "I don't think so." She looked away to examine the passing houses. Her manner had always been a little cool, but he didn't remember her being this standoffish with him. "Are you mad at me?" he asked uncertainly. "Is it because of what I said on the bridge? I'm sorry if I was rude." "It's not that," she interrupted, sighing. "I'm just not sure about you yet." "What?" "Nothing, never mind." She shook her head, shaking loose a few brilliant strands of hair from her bun. "Let's just get your money." Minato didn't know what to make of that. She probably just needed time to get used to him again, since she had always been slow to make friends, and maybe reaffirming an old friendship would need just as much careful treading. If she was anything like the old Kushina, one wrong move could easily chase her away for good. "Here we are," she said, as they approached the very house Minato had fled from not so long ago. She knew where he lived then. Did this mean she had actually visited his father in the past? "Can you wait here while I go get it?" he asked. There was a smell in that house that he didn't want to explain, one that he didn't want her to know. Kushina twirled her umbrella behind her and nodded. She was amenable at least. Minato heaved a deep breath and walked down the garden path towards his own front door. He hadn't locked it on his way out, so he pushed it open once more and stepped inside. The smell threatened to make him gag, but he forced himself to breathe and stay calm. It was far easier to keep a level head when there was someone outside to witness if he tried to disgrace himself by running away again. He just had to get the money and then get out. It would only take a few moments and he knew exactly where his father had kept his money box. He ran upstairs and into his father's bedroom. It was exactly as he remembered, as if his father had slept it in only last night. This hurt to think about, so he quickly dropped to his knees and began hunting around under the bed for the box he knew should have been there. The existence of this box was the reason he'd been able to feed and clothe himself for most of his young life. But it was not there. "It's a lot bigger on the inside than it is on the outside." That sounded like Kushina, coming from within the house. Minato raced out of the room to lean over the banister. Kushina was standing in the hall below, leaning forward to look into the kitchen. "You're supposed to be waiting outside," he protested. "Is there a reason why I can't come in?" she asked, and right then he knew he should have expected her to disobey. Once upon a time, she may have stood outside and argued with him until he let her inside or until he locked the door on her. Grown-up Kushina apparently just nodded and smiled and then did what she wanted anyway. She'd grown a lot sneakier. "I'm sorry about the smell," he said awkwardly. "What smell?" She peered around. "Where's your father? Is he at work?" He couldn't answer that, not honestly. He pushed away from the banister and, out of ancient habit, went to his room. Not much had changed here either except that it had acquired the musty stink of dust and disuse. Everything else was exactly as he had left it 3 years ago, and he was possibly the only person to have stepped into it since then. The bed creaked stiffly as he sat down on it, reminding him that this was the comfort he'd sought when he'd spent one too many nights sleeping on a hard, lumpy bedroll in the middle of a marsh. This room was, in a way, like Danzu's tent, full of indulgence and opulence that had been taken for granted by its owner. The squeaking floorboards on the stairs gave away Kushina as she climbed them. He heard her outside his door. "Don't come in," he said, though he might as well have not bothered. She appeared in the doorway and looked around. "This is your room?" she asked, staring with bold interest at his belongings. Despite asking her not to enter, she did just that. "There's a lot of pink." It had come with the house. His parents had never redecorated it when they'd moved in, but it felt so tiresome to explain why the walls were adorned with murals of pastel-colored fairies. "I like pink," he said indifferently. "Oh." She came into the room, an interminable snoop. She looked around at his shelves and his chest of drawers, then spotted something familiar resting next to his pillow. "I met him before," she said, bending down to pick it up. "Mr. Nose. You're Anteater, isn't it?" "Elephant," he corrected half-heartedly. Kushina sat down on the bed beside him, making it bounce, and placed Mr. Nose on his shoulder to tickle his cheek with the fuzzy trunk. "What's wrong?" she asked, for she evidently was not blind, and Minato was staring into space as if he'd just realized he'd been in a god-awful war. He took Mr. Nose off his shoulder and held him, between his knees, examining the toy that seemed so much smaller in his hands than before. He'd once doted on this bean-filled scrap of cloth. But, like many things in this village, he'd simply not thought about him for years. He had thought about his father even less. "Why should I have ridden to him?" he asked aloud. Kushina tilted her head quizzically. That was new. Normally she just grunted, "What?" when she was confused. When and where had she picked up this mannerism? "My father," Minato said. "He never wrote to me, why should I have ridden to him?" She shrugged, not knowing the answer. "And what would we talk about?" "Hey, remember that time you got drunk and locked me out of the house for 2 days? Did he tell you about that? All my father ever did was throw things and mope over a stupid old picture of my mother. How could he ever expect me to bother about him?" Kushina considered this quietly. "He wasn't even my father," Minato said, and he felt physically sick for giving voice to a truth he'd never openly acknowledged before, even though it was a secret known to anyone who was at all moderately informed. "My father could be one of any number of men in or out of this village, but the man I lived with was not him." Something about his choice of the past tense made Kushina narrow her eyes in confusion. "Minato," she said softly. "Where is your dad?" "He's gone," he said evenly. "He died." Kushina looked at him sharply, and he knew what was coming, the soothing, soft platitudes of meaningless apology. He'd heard them all, and he'd said a few in his time. He remembered years ago when Kushina had written to tell him about the death of her sensei's wife and the breakdown of said sensei, and all he could think of to say were the same things everyone said. He wouldn't begrudge her now for parroting the usual lines. "Do you want to cry?" she asked. "No," said Minato quickly, suddenly worried he was about to. "Do you want me to go?" He swallowed. "No. It's okay." He carried on staring morosely at the spots where Mr. Nose's eyes used to be, until he felt the soft cool touch of Kushina's fingers cautiously touching the back of his hand. She was awkward, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to touch him, and she settled for curling her finger lightly around 3 of his. Remarkably, all he could think of was her nails. He remembered them once being blunt and short and always caked in dirt. These days they were carefully filed to practical tips that were white and pink and as clean as the rest of her. Hesitantly, he curled his fingers round hers. Her hand felt much smaller than he remembered too. "You've changed," he said quietly. She was also looking at their joined hands. "Not as much as you." "Is that bad?" he wondered, because she didn't sound as happy as he felt when he realized how much she'd grown up. I'm not sure yet, she answered with a serious frown. Even when you're not here, people talked a lot about you, and I heard some things, but I'm glad you're here now. I'm just sorry that the only thing that could drag you back to us was something like this. I'm glad you're here too, he said slowly. I don't really want to be alone right now. Her fingers shyly squeezed his a little harder, and when he glanced up at her he saw she'd turned a fetching red and her eyes were glazed with the threat of tears. I'm sorry about your dad, she whispered. And there it was. This time, however, Minato smiled gratefully, because he knew that Kushina was the one person who truly meant it. Minato wasn't sure how he could have gotten through the next few days without Kushina, and this was perhaps the difference in her that left him most in awe. Although she offered to let him sleep over at her place initially, Minato sensed the reluctance in her voice and decided not to foist himself on her inconveniently. He guessed she wasn't perfectly at ease around him yet, but once it was decided that he would be renting a room out, she showed herself up to be the human incarnation of organization. She counted the funds from his father's money box after he'd eventually pulled it out from a cupboard, and had taken him straight to a pub which offered rented rooms that would suit his economic needs perfectly, balancing maximum comfort with affordability. When Minato asked just how she'd come to be so well versed with Konoha's temporary accommodation, she admitted to him that after she'd left the social center, she had bounced around between hotels and inns for quite a few months before she'd come to an arrangement with Mikoto. And when Minato had told her that he wasn't sure where he was supposed to start making arrangements for his father, she told him it was not as complicated as he probably thought, and then proceeded to give him the rundown of a set of complicated tasks, most of which he forgot by the time she got to the bottom of the list. He was quite glad she stayed with him to search his house for the will, and was there to drag him off to the village undertaker. Minato mostly stood back and let her wrangle the details out and argue the price of a ceremony with simple trimmings down to something that his money box would cover. If ever the undertaker suspected he was being outmaneuvered and tried to talk the price back up, Kushina just angry pointed back at Minato and said, "Does he look like he's made of money to you?" before reminding him that Minato was a village hero who had taken down one of the 7 swordsmen. Although, Minato didn't know if she was telling him this to impress him or implying some kind of threat. Minato wondered where this confidence in her had come from. He could guess that she had been involved with other funerals, especially if her sensei had not been very together after his wife's death, as her letters had inferred. This forthrightness astonished him. She had always been a little like that, but Minato could see that she could take care of herself better than people 3 times her age could. Having lost her parents and spent so much time alone, maybe it was a matter of necessity to be so devastatingly competent, because although Minato had managed without his parents all his life, he had always had people to rely on, his sensei, his adoring academy teachers, his adoring friends, his smitten, though sometimes murderous, commanding officers. They told him what to do, where to go, did him favors, offered him food and money and a place to sleep when he had none. He knew that once again he was relying on Kushina the same way he relied on them. He envied her a little, that she'd learned how to cope with life while he'd grown up on the edge of the world, hiding from it. Outside the undertaker's office, she handed all the paperwork to him, as if he had even the faintest idea of what it all meant. "That's that," she said with finality. "Remember, the funeral will be the day after tomorrow at 10. You may want to talk to an administrator at the Hokage Tower about the will. Looks like your dad didn't update it after you were born, and he's left everything to some distant nephew or whatever. I don't know if you can do anything about that, but maybe there's some legal loophole that will allow you to keep something. Oh, and go to the bank. I saw some statements at your house for an account in your name, so your dad kept some savings aside for you at least, probably from all your missions and your military wages." Right. Minato thought he should be writing this down on his hand. All he could really think about was the ceremony in 2 days' time. "Are you going to come?" She looked at him evenly. "I shouldn't impose." "No, you won't," he said quickly. "It's just that I don't think my dad really had many friends, or any friends. So I'm worried I'll be the only one there." She tilted her head to side, disbelieving. Minato, you're the yellow flasher, Flash. Yes, so, I'd be surprised if half the village didn't turn up just for you, she pointed out. Okay, he nodded. But you'll be in that half, right? She looked away. If you want. Thank you, he said, and she only looked embarrassed. I have stuff to do, Kushina said, edging away from him. The lupins she'd bought were beginning to wilt a little and he realized he'd already taken up most of her day. I'll see you around, okay? He waved as she left, and this was when he noticed even her gait had changed. There was still a little bit of the tomboyish strut to her walk, but it was thrown off somewhat by the side tilting of her curved hips. If Minato was honest with himself, he would have realized he was just admiring Kushina's rather lovely backside with the natural enthusiasm of any young man for an attractive young woman, but he was not honest, and so told himself that he was just impersonally analyzing her strength and balance. She was probably an excellent fighter these days, he said to himself. He smiled and headed back towards his designated pub, wondering if Kushina was aware of just how much she'd changed. There was a story he'd once heard about an ugly duckling who, in the manner of most fairy tales, had the last laugh against his tormentors when he inevitably became beautiful, which was all that ever seemed to matter in such stories. Unfortunately, the simple idealism that formed these moral tales did not inform reality. Kushina was still a little odd, and not at all easy to approach even for someone like him, and a perfect complexion had not made Inoichi respect her any more or caused AI to hate her any less. Still, she looked well. Somehow, at some point, she had found a reason to take pride in herself and stop hiding beneath dirt and unwashed overalls, and so Minato was happy for her. He just wondered what had caused her to change so much. Or who? Until the funeral, Minato wasn't sure what to do with himself. He wandered like a distracted cat around the village, reacquainted himself with people and places he'd almost forgotten, occasionally remembering to carry out the little errands Kushina had set him. The administrators in the Hokage Tower were no help. His father's will was absolute, he'd left Minato nothing, not even the house. After living in a crowded tent for 3 years, Minato didn't think he cared and tried not to think too hard about why his father had never updated his will to include Minato. Had it just been laziness, or a deliberate snub to a child he must always have known was not his? Did it matter anyway? He was not used to possessing much, and the thought of inheriting any kind of property was overwhelming. He would only need Kushina to come round and tell him what to do with it anyway. So with nary a shrug, he let the matter go. Whatever his father's reasons, he would be taking them to the grave. This done, he dutifully visited the ice cream parlor belonging to AI's mother, who gave him a 100% discount on the spot. She said he was too thin and needed feeding up, and he helped himself to 3 bowls of syrup-slavered sorbet before she was satisfied enough to let him go. He did feel better though, as she had promised. After that, he went to the bookstore. He wasn't a big reader, but he'd seen Jiraiya's name in the shop window and an ache of longing had filled him like a kind of grief he could not feel for his father, compelling him into the store to pick up a copy of his sensei's debut novel. At night he returned once more to his extremely comfortable room behind the pub, lit a fire in the hearth to remind himself of the smoky campfires out on the border, and curled up in bed to read Ika Ika Delight. He put it down after 3 pages, face burning hotter than the fire. It was probably not decent to read such things the night before you buried your father. The next morning, he went down to the cemetery wearing his uniform sans its green vest, for he didn't own anything else appropriate. He headed to the family tomb where the service would be held and his father's ashes would be placed beside those of his wife and his parents. One day Minato guessed he would end up in the same place, though the only person he was really related to was his mother. He had no idea where her parents lay, or their parents. His family tree started with his mother only, and in ninja circles where the elite clans could trace their ancestors back to the feudal age, this was a very meager lineage indeed. At the tomb, he arrived to quite the surprise. When Kushina had said half the village would come to pay their respects, she'd been wrong of course, but 30 people was still more than he had ever expected, and as he stood there and waited, more still arrived. There was Inoichi, looking unusually somber and humble when he greeted Minato. Ai's mother, who apologized haltingly that her daughter couldn't make it. Chichi and Chuza, a couple of the Hyuga and Uchiha, and several more people he hadn't seen since the academy, people who couldn't possibly know who his father was, but had come all the same for Minato if no one else. He felt a little uncomfortable, looking around at so many faces he either didn't know or couldn't remember, until a shimmer of red caught his eye and his heart warmed, because Kushina was there. She was standing on the other side of the tomb in the same black clothes he'd last seen her in, standing with a very lovely dark-haired girl. It took Minato a moment to recognize Mikoto, although what he noticed first was her uncanny similarity to Kushina, in both the style of her hair and the clothes she wore. This, he supposed, solved the mystery of who had been teaching Kushina about fashion and personal hygiene. They were evidently very close friends, but at that moment, neither girl was speaking to one another and Mikoto was standing far more closely to a tall dark-haired man. Her fiancé? Minato couldn't remember the guy's name, but with that thin and slightly angry face, he looked nothing like the nickname of Pufferfish that Kushina had given him. So while one friend was standing with her man, Kushina in turn was standing a little closer to someone else too. Once more, it took Minato a moment too long to recognize him, though he would have been forgiven, for Hitaki Tsukumo had changed a lot in 3 years, and perhaps the only reason Minato recognized him at all was because of a small white-haired child swinging on his arm in boredom. He'd heard a lot about that little boy, and he really did look like his father. Tsukumo, however, had begun to resemble a much older man. Once the ceremony began, it was swift and brief. Everyone stood around, looking somber, or placing flowers respectfully around the tomb as the ashes were placed inside it. All that was left of his father now fit into that little urn. Minato had had plenty of time to decide how he would feel at this moment, but he still wasn't sure what the tightness in his chest meant. Sorrow? Anxiety? Relief? Guilt? He kept looking up, away from his father's grave to Kushina. In this grim little cemetery where everyone came dressed in every shade between black and gray, she was a little dazzling, standing there with her vivid red hair and her rosy cheeks. The expression on her face captivated him far more than it should. Were those upturned eyebrows and downturned mouth because she felt sorrow over his father? Or because she was standing so close to her friend's fiancé who she detested? Or because she was concerned about the boy standing between her and her sensei who was beginning to ask loud, impertinent questions about what was going on? He looked away from her, unsettled that he could spend more time gazing at his old friend than he could keep his mind on his father. But to be fair, he wasn't the only one. His gaze wandered across to Inoichi who was also staring in Kushina's direction and sighing imperceptibly. The boy really was too obvious. As the ceremony closed, Minato felt indescribably weary. This wasn't the most physically taxing thing he'd ever done in his life, and all the same, he knew he would have liked to do nothing but crawl into bed and sleep the rest of the day away. But while there were countless people here all wishing to tell him how sorry they were and how they imagined how proud his father would be of him today, there would be no chance of sneaking off. He smiled at his well-wishers and bore it admirably until he found himself faced quite unexpectedly with Mikoto. "Hello, you," she smiled sweetly. "It's been a long time." "Hello Mikoto," he said, smiling back a little more genuinely. "You look great." "Huh, and you've grown so tall," she exclaimed. "I feel a little nervous, actually. Speaking to a living legend like this." "Nah. I've just had some lucky scrapes, that's all," he said. "How've you been? I heard you were living with Kushina now." "Yes, although not for much longer. I'm getting married soon." "I heard about that." "To Fugu." "Fugu. Fugaku," she supplied quickly. "Yes. Already?" I thought you'd wait until you were older. 16 seems a little young. She shrugged. I'm old enough, so why put it off, she reasoned, though her smile was a little more subdued. Minato searched the crowd and saw her fiancé standing quite a way off, talking to someone else. Are you sure? He wondered. She sighed in kind exasperation. You're beginning to sound like Kushina. I know she doesn't approve of the match. Emphatically, she nodded. But really, she's just being selfish. That surprised Minato. It must have shown on his face, because Mikoto quickly explained. She's a little possessive of her friends, she doesn't like sharing them. I think she'd rather we be spinsters together forever, but... You know. She has to get used to the fact that people grow up and get married eventually. If she wants someone all to herself, maybe she should find herself a guy. I thought she already had someone. Minato hedged uncertainly. Mikoto frowned at him, confused. Oh. You mean Sarutobi, she said. Well. I don't know much about that guy. I think he's still stationed at the waterfall border, but she doesn't talk much about him, though everyone says. Says? Minato prompted. Mikoto pressed her lips together. I don't like to gossip about things I don't really know much about. Especially considering what you're probably going through. You don't need me wittering away at you. He hadn't felt that way at all, but Mikoto was already excusing herself, heading back to her fiancé's side. He looked around, hoping to find Kushina, but all he saw was her sensei coming towards him purposefully. Minato almost retreated to hide behind some other guests. Tsukumo looked harder than ever and he'd never been pleasant to Minato before, so everything inside him screamed to run. But one had to hold on to one's dignity at a funeral, so Minato valiantly held his ground. I'm sorry for your loss, Minato-kun, Tsukumo said, as a manner of greeting. Though it's good to have you back home again. As if Tsukumo had ever missed him. Thank you. You've made Kushina quite the happy girl, her sensei told him. Minato's mouth opened, but he didn't know what to say. His brain was still trying to dissect and comprehend the meaning of those words. Oh, he said intelligently. Don't get any ideas, Tsukumo said shortly, giving him such a look that a shiver of near-genuine fear rippled down Minato's spine. Okay, he squeaked meekly. I do hope you stay in the village a while longer, Tsukumo went on, as if he hadn't just sent something short of a death threat his way. I reckon if you stick around the Hokage might like a word with you soon. There's a promotion on the cards, isn't there? Which just hastened Minato's resolve to split from this town as soon as possible. Ah, what are you two talking about? Kushina popped out from behind her sensei, a little boy swinging like a monkey from her hand. She looked suspiciously at Tsukumo while the boy looked obstinately at Minato. Nothing, her sensei said quite innocently. His manner was markedly different with her than with Minato, like he suddenly became a much more mellow person. I was just congratulating your friend on his imminent promotion. Kushina looked at Minato and then looked back. And why does he look scared? I have no idea what you mean, Tsukumo said, and crouched to scoop up his son who was now pulling faces at Minato, much to Minato's shock. Come on, Kakashi. We should go or we'll be late for your exams again. Don't do that, if the wind changes, your face will stick like that and you'll have to wear a mask forever. As her sensei departed with his son, Kushina turned a little anxiously to Minato. He didn't threaten you, did he? No, Minato said quickly, though had to rethink that. Yes. Maybe. I'm not really sure. She sighed. Don't mind him. He just thinks you're an arrogant, conceited player with a big head. Oh. This didn't make him feel much better. I've tried to tell him you're not, but the more I insist, the more convinced he is that you're no good. She shook her head and looked at the mound of flowers around his family's grave. I think this turned out quite well, don't you think? Sure, he said faintly. But I doubt anyone here even knows who my father is. So? I wouldn't mind a bunch of strangers turning up at my funeral. Better than no one. Better than not even having a grave marker. Minato sealed his lips. He would not complain, not when he knew Kushina was standing next to him, thinking about her mother's death that went unnoticed by the world and unremarked upon by the living. His father had had a decent ceremony, and that was all that mattered. And the one person he had to thank for that was Kushina. So he said, "Thank you." "No problem," she said, brushing it off with a self-conscious shrug like her contribution didn't matter. "You'll be all right though, won't you? Did you ask at the administration offices about the will?" He told her honestly that he had, though it had been hopeless. "I'll have to find somewhere else to live," he said, "but I don't think I have to worry about it for a while yet. I'm still needed at the border, so who knows when I'll be back in the village on a more permanent basis." Kushina's eyes narrowed at him, as if he'd said something nonsensical. "But I thought you were back for good," she said quietly. "I only came to take care of my father." "Weren't you discharged for your health?" she asked. Now it was his turn to look confused. No. I must have heard wrong," she said, tapping her lip thoughtfully in a gesture he'd never seen before on her, though he wondered if he'd seen Mikoto doing it. "I could have sworn I heard someone in headquarters saying you had been sequestered pending mental health evaluation because someone had reported problems with you." She looked at his brain-dead expression as if it very well could have been true. "Shikaku," he said. "Who?" Kushina wrinkled her nose. "The guy I'm going to kill." Once the funeral service was over he went without delay, without even changing his clothes, to the Jonin headquarters where all decisions pertaining to who went and who stayed were made. If, as he hoped, nothing at all was wrong, he would be able to put in his request for redeployment and within a week could be back at the border to help the final, dribbling war efforts. But if Kushina was correct. "I'm afraid you're suspended," said the Jonin after calling Minato into her office. "We processed a request 2 days ago to give you a mental health evaluation. We were just about to give you notice. Apparently some of your fellow comrades have suspicions about your ability to cope with prolonged fighting." "This is a misunderstanding," Minato insisted, trying to appear as sane as possible. "My superior officer was out to get me and my friend thought I was a lunatic for going on a suicide mission. It wasn't really a big deal." "Your superior officer is out to get you," echoed the Jonin mildly. "He sent a prostitute to kill me," Minato told her. "I see." She primly straightened some papers on her desk. "Well, if there's nothing to worry about, your assessment will be clean and you'll be permitted to return to duty as soon as possible." "And how long will the assessment take?" Minato asked in dread. "A couple of weeks." Minato sighed loudly. The Jonin looked at him sharply. "You're a young man," she said with a hint of reproach in her tone. "You shouldn't be living for war. Take this opportunity to relax and spend some time with friends, and perhaps when the assessment is over, you won't be so quick to leave all this behind. Besides, troops are already being pulled out. You have to get used to the fact that war ends and life moves on." This was of little use to Minato, who had the uncomfortable feeling that he didn't actually have a life. He hadn't particularly enjoyed it out on the border, but he'd had a niche, and he'd been good at what he was doing, and suddenly being grounded back in the village left him feeling like a flightless bird. His purpose was gone, for now at least, until he cleared up the mess Shikaku had thrust upon him, and his father had died, irrevocably changing his life here forever. It would take him a while to find his place again. "Well. Thanks anyway," he sighed. "No problem," said the Jonin. "And keep your chin up. You're up for promotion, aren't you?" "Right." In resignation he returned to his little room behind the public house, knowing now that this was not to be some temporary jaunt. This was indefinite. Still, he continued to refuse, looking too closely at his feelings in fear of discovering this development was upsetting him more than his father's death. In truth, he should have been grieving right then, preoccupied by thoughts only about his father, but he was struggling to keep his mind on mortality and off things like the trouble Shikaku had caused and Kushina's skin. And so, besides the frustration and confusion that mired him, he also found himself wallowing in shame. The next few weeks were not easy. Being hauled in for mental health assessment also meant he couldn't even do regular missions until he was given the all-clear. And it was a little embarrassing, he had to admit, to be seen going into the psychiatric ward of the village hospital, where some tedious woman who didn't seem to ever blink asked him a lot of deceptively mundane questions and stared at him as he tried to give her the most mundane, sane answers he could think of. "What's your favorite color, Minato?" she asked. Red," he said, and watched her scribble something awfully long-winded in her notebook as if he'd just revealed his passion for wearing dresses on weekends and calling himself Minako. His friends seemed rather understanding, or perhaps just a touch careful not to vex him. Impossibly, he was revered even more so. Heroes with dubious mental health were, as Chi-Chi told him, much more exciting, which was just what Minato needed because she informed him that he had little personality to speak of anyway. Which was kind of her to mention. Inoichi was always a little subdued around him. If he still told lewd jokes about Kushina, or any girl, he stopped them around Minato, and if ever the conversation turned to Kushina or they crossed paths on the street, he seemed to avoid looking at her. He was apparently trying to make an effort not to give anyone the impression he was interested in her. This was somewhat ruined by the fact that he cornered Kushina one afternoon outside her house and begged her to go out with him. Kushina related the story to Minato in mortification. "And what did you say?" he asked her. "I said I was already seeing someone," she whispered. He looked really desperate. "You didn't tell him to eat?" "Sure, no, I didn't need to," she interrupted. "I don't know why, but he's not as unbearable as he used to be. I told him the girl at the flower stall was interested in him, and that seemed to cheer him up at least." Kushina, on the other hand, was becoming more unbearable than ever. The date of Mikoto's wedding was approaching, and with every day it edged nearer, the more Kushina began to resemble a snapping turtle in her temperament. It was quite easy to see her in the market in the morning, buying flowers or groceries, and to call out a cheerful "hello," only to be treated to a foul glare, a biting retort, and/or a string of expletives. Oddly, this was more like the Kushina he remembered, so he was more than comfortable when she was like this. When she wasn't on a mission, he could usually find her on the market street in the mornings, and from there he could contrive a casual excuse to accompany her to wherever she headed next, which was usually to breakfast at a tea house or the library. He was more than happy to listen to her talk, or rather rant, about Mikoto and Fugueface and their wedding. "I don't know what she sees in him," she said loudly in the library one morning, browsing shelves for books, for at some point in his absence she had learned to love them. Unfortunately, they were not of the academic, broaden your horizons kind, they were more of the trashy point horror kind. "He's this horrible po-faced smug bastard who thinks he can snap his fingers and everyone should obey his every whim, including Mikoto. How can anyone marry someone like that? They should definitely wait another 5 years, or, at least until she can longer stand him. It'll happen eventually. Even Mikoto's patience has limits." "Shoo," hissed some unseen busybody from behind one of the many stacks of books around them. "Sh," hissed back Kushina, much more loudly. "Some people are so rude," she exclaimed. "Have they invited you to their wedding yet?" Minato stirred. It had been a long time since she'd invited him to speak, and he'd been staring at this dog-eared copy of Unbelievable Ghost Sightings for so long he'd almost forgotten he existed. No, he said. "Why not?" she asked. Well, I think they were going to," he said, dimly recalling an incident 3 days ago when the couple in question had approached him unexpectedly in what seemed like an obvious opening to invite the hero of Konoha along to the most important day of their lives. But then I forgot Fugaku's name, and all that came out of my mouth was Fugu. Kushina gave him a proud smile. They left quite quickly after that. Well, I'm allowed to invite one other person with me if my invite doesn't get revoked by then. You can be my +1 if you like. He closed his book. Really? Isn't there someone else you'd rather invite? She looked confused. Everyone else I know already has an invite. What about Sarutobi? Saru's still on tour at the waterfall border, she said dismissively, looking down at her long, pretty fingers. He won't make it back in time. That's a shame, sighed Minato, not missing how she'd shortened his name to just Monkey in a way that could have been rudeness or affection. Kushina pulled a face. Why? I'd like to meet him, I guess. Why? Why wouldn't I? She thought about that. You have enough fans without actively looking for more. I just want to meet the people who are important to you, that's all, he said. Why? She repeated, suspicion intensifying on her face. I keep hearing about him. From who? Well, not from you. You hardly ever mention him. Probably because he's none of your business. You don't want to talk about him? He wondered. Her fingers tapped against the table and her mouth twisted to the side. No, she said. Is he ugly? Kushina looked uncomfortable. Minato, stop it. You're a very private person, aren't you? He observed with a faint smile. She echoed the smile more uncertainly. And you didn't used to pry. You can't blame me for being curious, he said, watching her get up. Was she about to stalk off in one of her legendary huffs? Every time I hear his name, yours follows, and vice versa. You're my friend, so I thought you'd want to talk about him. Saru is my captain. What else do you want me to say about him? She said, moving to start aggressively hunting through the books on the shelf behind her so that he couldn't see her face. I think you mentioned him in your letters. You said you were becoming friends with him. We're friends. So what? She demanded. Her defensiveness only confirmed that they had to be a lot more than just friends, though he didn't know if her caginess was because of fraternization rules between subordinates and superiors, or because she really was as intensely private as she acted. I'm just glad, he said with a mild shrug. When I left, you didn't have many friends. Now you have quite a few. I have enough, she said curtly. Unlike some people who make 1,000,000 friends and forget their faces as soon. As they leave the room, my friends mean a lot to me even if they are few. When she turned back to the table with a new book, she witnessed his stupid smile. What? She snapped. I never forgot you. Then why did you stop writing? Minato sat back, surprised. She'd said it with such swift, righteous anger that he realized it was a question she'd been holding in her hand for a long time, waiting to present to him since the moment he first got back. All he could think to say was, you were the one who stopped. The old glue in her book's spine cracked audibly as she opened it and proceeded to glare at its pages. Another horror novel. One could glean many strange and interesting ways to kill irritating people from a book like that, and he hoped it wasn't giving her ideas. I never, she said firmly. But you did, after I sent you that letter about Sensei's wife and having to fight Waterfall. You could have at least had the decency to respond. I did, he protested, indignant that he could be so wronged. She looked at him as if not sure whether to believe him. I never got another word from you after that. All I heard about you was from the stuff people were saying, and I realized you probably didn't want to be bothered trading letters with some stupid girl anymore. His mouth dropped open. What were people saying? Unable to concentrate on her book, she clapped it shut again. You know, everyone knew who you were before you were the yellow flasher, Flash. And they said you were the best ninja in the war against the Water Country and possibly the best ninja of any war of any period. They said you had killed over 100 people in your first year, that you killed a prostitute in your second, and wiped out a whole mist outpost in your third. Minato could see his reputation seemed to get bigger the further away from him it got. None of that's really true. Really? She looked a tiny bit relieved. Well, I lost count of how many people I killed by the first year. The prostitute was really an assassin posing as a prostitute, and I only wiped some of the outpost out, not all of it. Relief turned to a fixed stare that reminded him strongly of his mental health assessor, like she was mulling over the state of his mind in her own before she finally sighed and looked at her hands again. We're not really the same people we used to be, are we? She asked quietly. You've changed so much, I don't really understand you anymore. You're the one who changed, Kushina, he stated simply. Maybe because you've grown so much I look different to your eyes. She shrugged stiffly. For someone who could articulate so well in anger, she clammed up spectacularly when she was somber. Well, you weren't the only one who heard things, he said. Aren't there rumors going around that you spent a year at the waterfall border and didn't kill a single enemy? She shook her head, looking dismayed and annoyed. That's not true, she said. Deliberately not looking at him. I killed one person, and then I decided not to do it anymore. How can you just decide like that? He frowned in confusion. Captains didn't hesitate to give penalties to Nin who didn't carry out their orders. These were my own people, what was I supposed to do? She shrugged helplessly. Waterfall is full of former Whirlpool citizens, and by some flip of a coin I could just as easily have ended up on the other side of that war, fighting a losing battle. So you're a pacifist now? He said incredulously. She really was a long way from the girl who had once tried to convince him that some people deserved to die. Kushina gave him a frustrated look. You say that like it's a dirty word. But it's not like I ran away or stopped doing my job. Just because I didn't kill my opponents doesn't make me a coward. I never said you were, he said quickly. Well, that's what everyone else said. I let them escape. I had to. Our force was too small to take prisoners, so it was either kill them or let them go. So I let them go. This was incomprehensible to Minato. Sometimes enemies had escaped him, and a few he'd cheerfully let scamper away, but to allow that in every single confrontation? How could a war be won if defeated enemies were allowed to regroup and return to fight another day? What did your captain say? He asked. What does it matter what Sara said? She snapped, which Minato took to mean he wasn't best pleased. We won the war within the year, so it obviously didn't matter what I did. But maybe at least there are people walking around today who wouldn't be here otherwise. Minato could not say the same for himself. He could count on one hand the number of people he'd shown mercy to, and because of him there were hundreds of people, mothers, fathers, children, and friends who were not walking around today. And this is why you don't like me? He asked. You think I'm some deranged killer now? I never said that. It's impossible for anyone to dislike you, she chided, which seemed like a good way not to answer his question. You're just more distant than I remember. You don't talk much anymore. Was he distant? If he said little it was because he could think of nothing to say, not because he was consciously keeping his distance. He remained silent because she filled that silence with a voice that was soft and ever so slightly husky, which undulated appealingly with the traces of an old Whirlpool accent. Why would he interrupt that? Or maybe you just talk more these days, he pointed out. Sorry, she said contritely. No, I like that, he amended quickly. Girls could be a little sensitive to accusations of talking too much, he found. You're interesting. She grimaced as if she didn't find this even remotely believable. There are far more interesting people than me to hang out with. Yes, he agreed, because she didn't like silly placatory lies. But you smell better than they do. Perhaps that had been a little too honest. A puzzled kind of smirk pulled up her lip. You're so weird. But then she smiled and laughed too, so he could assume that she at least somewhat approved of his weirdness. The wedding between Uchiha Fugaku and Uchiha Mikoto was held on a beautiful autumn day when the forests were turning red and crisp leaves littered the streets like brown paper stars. It was the talk of the village, naturally, since this marriage would cement Fugaku's place as the head of the Uchiha clan, and such a person was always of political interest in Konoha, where the Uchiha controlled so many departments. There was no mistaking that this was a marriage of convenience, but there was always a titter of romance about arranged marriages. In these traditional households it was viewed as the beginning of a love story, whereas a marriage between longtime lovers was merely the conclusion. Kushina insisted this was the beginning of a horror story, regardless of the many rumors that the bride was in love with the groom. She turned up outside his rented room behind the pub on the day of the wedding, dressed alarmingly in black again, and she looked approvingly at his own choice of outfit, as all he owned was black. "This is the worst day of my life," she lamented passionately, as they made their way down to the Uchiha compound where the ceremony would take place. "I think Mikoto is quite happy," he tried to remind her. "But who cares if Kushina is unhappy," grumped Kushina. She was in an especially bad mood that day, not just because of the imminent wedding, but because yesterday her home had been invaded by a band of Uchiha cousins who had packed all Mikoto's belongings into boxes to take to her new address. This was upsetting at the best of times, Kushina said, but particularly because they had packed Kushina's collection of tropical ferns by mistake. Minato hadn't known Kushina was the kind of person to keep tropical ferns. He was still learning things about her even now. "Cheer up," he cajoled. He'd seen happier suicidal people than Kushina. "I will not. And I will never cheer up again," she declared ardently. People knew when Kushina had arrived, for she brought with her the most incredible aura of malice and gloom. She might as well have been followed by a little black raincloud wherever she went, and though a few people were brave enough to approach Minato and exchange a few gushing pleasantries and worship, no one quite had the nerve to look Kushina in the eye. If this was a fairy tale wedding, she was the evil, jealous witch who had turned up to curse the happy couple, though it was not the groom she coveted, but the bride. Here was everyone dressed in their best and brightest kimonos, and there was Kushina, like an angry ink blot in the midst of a sea of joyful color. Because it didn't really feel right to ditch the person who'd invited him along, he was more or less stuck with her. And her gloom was infectious. Anyone who looked over at them would think they'd mistaken this for another funeral, as they skulked together looking equally miserable. The Uchiha were the kind of people who observe tradition to the letter. Minato had never seen an authentic old-fashioned wedding dress before, complete with its enormous white hood, and Mikoto carried it off beautifully. Perhaps it was because her makeup had been done by artisans and she was glowing with demure happiness, but Minato finally noticed that Mikoto was not just pretty but was in fact stunning. As he watched her proceed to the altar, he saw her Suntoba husband was not at all indifferent to his Suntobof. An arranged marriage it might have been, yes, but these two were the happiest people in the room. Minato looked at Kushina and sighed. She was grinding her teeth and looking at Fugaku as if she might be able to make his head explode with the power of her mind alone. She would refuse to be happy for her friend out of principle, but fortunately the couple were too wrapped up in the vows to notice the gremlin in the first row. And when it came time for the groom to lean in and kiss his beautiful wife, Kushina gave a great jerk which made Minato fear she was about to leap to her feet and push them apart. Just to be safe, he grabbed Kushina's hand and held on tight to prevent her from moving. It seemed to work. Kushina forgot to glare at Fugaku because she was busy blushing and trying to wriggle her hand free from his. By the time he let go, the vows were complete and there was nothing Kushina could do to further interfere. While everyone clapped and cheered and accepted ceremonial sake, the red-headed troll slunk away instead of joining the clamor of congratulations. Minato worried she would regret it. The first person who came up to Minato was Inoichi. "What were you doing here with Kushina?" he asked suspiciously. "Are you two dating or something?" "No," Minato said. "I'm her +1. Tell me that's a euphemism for a sex buddy." "What do you care who Kushina is with, you're here with the flower girl," Minato pointed out. Said flower girl was currently speaking to Mikoto, complimenting the floral arrangements around the hall in a strained way, for if she had been in charge of said arrangements, she would have gone for peonies to denote a happy marriage, and certainly not the travesty of purple aconitum which everyone knew inferred a foe was nearby. Said flower girl was also unaware of Kushina. "You have no shame, Namikaze," Inoichi said coyly. "Don't you have a girl back out on the border?" "Do I?" Minato wondered. "Shikaku has told me all about Yoshi." "Yes, he probably has. He's besotted with her." "Not his Yoshi. Your Yoshi. The blonde one." "Oh," said Minato, suddenly remembering he had completely forgotten her. "Yes. How come you haven't said anything about her?" Inoichi said suspiciously. "Hoping Kushina won't find out?" Now he realized why Kushina got so cagey when he pressed her about Sarutobi. Being quizzed on your romances was probably classed as torture in some countries. He shifted uncomfortably and wished there was some brightly colored ball or toy he could use to distract Inoichi. "I don't think Kushina would really care. I told you, we're not together like that." "Just as well," said Inoichi, "Sarutobi's coming home soon and he'll probably flay anyone alive who's moved in on his territory." "Is that so?" Minato murmured, knowing full well that Inoichi would happily have risked such a flaying. "I didn't realize Kushina was a territory." "And a very fine one, I'd be happy to conquer any time," Inoichi said. Minato made a gesture like he was reaching for a kunai from the absent holster on his hip. Inoichi flinched impressively. "Relax," he smiled, contriving to appear as if he hadn't intended to scare the other boy. "I wouldn't stab you. Not at a wedding." "Yes, well." Not at all comforted, Inoichi peered around furtively and asked, "You haven't seen Kushina around, have you?" Although he may have been looking for backup against Minato's questionable sanity. "I'm sure she's around." Like Minato was stupid enough to point the way. "Probably scrounging around for the bouquet," Inoichi said. "It's not that kind of wedding," Minato reminded. He couldn't imagine the noble Uchiha partaking in anything as whimsical as flower lobbing. "And I doubt Kushina's that eager to get married." "Don't be so sure. Sarutobi is a handsome guy, even I'd be tempted." Inoichi spotted the flower girl waving to him and gladly slipped away through the crowd to join her. Minato looked around for familiar faces. There was Hatake Sakumo over there, minus his son, so Minato made sure to move discreetly in the opposite direction to avoid any more awkward confrontations. Did the Jonin really regard him as an arrogant, conceited player? Although in a village where most of the population held him in ridiculously high esteem, one or two who judged him negatively shouldn't have mattered. Except it was Kushina-sensei, and for some stupid reason, he'd always sort of hoped that the kind of person she would look up to would also like him. There you are. So busy avoiding the senior Hatake, he'd almost literally walked into the bride. "Mikoto," he said, nodding to her pleasantly, and then to her husband. "Fugaku." And if there was one person who hated him even more, it was Uchiha Fugaku. The bride coughed sweetly as a muscle twitched in her groom's cheek. There was no salvaging the wreck of his first impression now, and he could only blame Kushina for planting just a damn memorable nickname into his head. Congratulations," he forced out, trying to move away from his blunder. "Thank you," Mikoto said graciously. "Did Kushina invite you along?" Because Fugueface certainly hadn't. "Yes, she's around somewhere," he said. "Probably poisoning my wine as we speak," Fugaku said. "Hush," Mikoto said. As much as she apparently disliked Kushina talking ill about her husband, she didn't like it when he did it either. "Come on, we have to say hello to your grandparents," Fugaku said, steering his new wife away by the elbow. He was a little domineering, and Minato wondered if in a few years that would begin to chafe against Mikoto's nerves. For now at least, she was still glowing with delight and happiness, even if she looked a little troubled as she turned to call to Minato over her shoulder. "If you see her, tell her I'm looking for her," she said, before she was soundly whisked back into the clutches of her clan. Where was Kushina, anyway? Minato wandered from one end of the hall to the other, looking around for the girl who should have been extremely easy to spot, dressed in black and with such vivid red hair. But it seemed she'd snuck out of the room entirely. Perhaps she'd gone back out the front of the building? Something told him that Kushina, who disliked crowds and preferred her little hidey-holes, would have headed the opposite way. He found a side door and slipped through it into the quieter confines of the house, down corridors that led to many empty rooms and one bustling kitchen. A door to a private garden was propped open to let the heat of the cooking out. Minato followed the breeze onto a quaint little patio and followed the path down to what looked like the shadiest, weediest part of the garden. And indeed, that was where he found Kushina, crouched down behind an old shed with tears streaming down her face. She swore when she saw him. "What do you want?" "Nothing urgent," he promised, shifting awkwardly. There were few things more painful to witness in this world than a crying girl. I can come back." "Just spit it out, Flasher," she said, scrubbing at her face. "What do you want?" "It's Flash," he corrected patiently, "but it's not really important." "Are you okay?" "I'll live," she croaked, giving a great big shuddering sigh. "You'll still see her, you know," he said, moving forward to crouch tentatively on the mossy rocks beside her. "It's not like you'll never see her again. She's only moving down the road." Kushina have him a watery glare. "It won't be the same. It was bad enough before when they spent every other second together. Now they're actually married." "You could try being happy for them," he suggested tentatively. That seemed a little too radical for Kushina. She pulled a face, before burying it in her arms. "I'd rather not," she said. "It would only encourage them." "Oh, come on, what's so bad about Fugaku?" he wondered. "The guy's a bit stiff, but he honestly seems to love her." "He's bad, I can feel it," Kushina said simply, lifting her head to glare off into the trees. "He's going to get her into real trouble one of these days." He smiled at her. "You're too suspicious. And you only bother to see the good in people," she retorted. "Fugaku is bad news. I can wait though. He'll pull something one day and I'll be right there with the divorce papers." Traditionally it was the couple who decided when they should divorce, not their friends, but Kushina was totally convincing. He believed her. "Look on the bright side," he said, spreading his hands. "Mikoto may be marrying a sour-faced pufferfish, but since she's moved out you'll have more room to yourself. Isn't that something?" "No," she said sullenly. "I hate living by myself. It's way too quiet and I can't afford the rent alone, which means I'll have to find someone else to share with, and I hate breaking in new tenants." He smiled. "Think how I feel. I've got to find a place to live, and people can be pretty picky who they rent out to." Kushina scoffed indelicately. "You have a legendary title now. You could waltz up to the Hokage himself and demand a room, he'd probably give it you." "I was thinking of something a little more in price range," he said. "Remind me. What is my price range?" She knew his accounts far better than he did. She sniffed, rubbing her nose with the back of her hand. "There's this bridge that goes over a river that I think you might like." He laughed sarcastically. "Do I look like a troll?" "Only sometimes," she replied ruefully, though at least her eyes were beginning to dry and her voice had stopped cracking. "What do you have to worry about, seriously? You could just mooch off your millions of friends for the rest of your life if you like. Or I could move in with you." Her eyes jumped to his and searched his face. "Steady on," she muttered, turning pink as if he'd suggested she take her clothes off in front of him. "Well, why not?" he asked. He turned to her more fully, eyes bright with the perfect solution he could see unraveling neatly before them. You need a tenant and I need a place to live. You don't have to break me in because I'm already broken. Mentally maybe, she remarked, looking away. Kushina was avoiding an answer. His proposal had clearly made her uncomfortable and she looked as if she was searching for a way to change the subject or turn him down politely, but the trees she was staring so hard at weren't going to give her the answer she was looking for. Anyone would think he'd proposed marriage the way she'd reacted. He sighed quietly to himself. It's just a convenient solution, he pointed out. Sharing with girls is one thing, she said. Boys. Just the one boy, he reminded quickly. And it's not like you don't know me. I know, but... She winced awkwardly, holding her arms about her more tightly. Her eyes still refused to meet his, and Minato felt this was somewhat like trying to stab the hardest pea on the plate with a fork. She would keep skittering away every time he tried to pin her down for a straight answer. Is this about Sarutobi? He guessed. Perhaps she was thinking her boyfriend wouldn't be happy if he returned to find another man in her house. Would you stop going on about him? She sighed, exasperated. What would this have to do with him? Minato shrugged at her. He wasn't entirely sure himself anyway. I'll think about it, Kushina said evasively, getting to her feet and brushing the soft strands of moss that clung to her lovely backside. It was really quite interesting to watch, and while she was avoiding his eyes, he was free to stare as much as he liked. If no one else wants the room, I'll consider it. Good, he said dryly. I like being people's last resort. Quite the change for you, huh? She reached out to offer him a hand. You coming? He accepted it dubiously. Coming where? She had extraordinary strength in those lean arms, and she pulled him to his feet as if he wasn't so much taller and had 3 stones on her. From out of her pocket she pulled a narrow flask that was unmistakably the kind of flask grizzly old alcoholics took swigs from when they were away from a pub. He shot her a look of faint reproach as she twirled the flask around her fingers from its short strap. This party's a little stiff and traditional, isn't it? She remarked. Let's liven it up a little. Where's that punch bowl? Her propensity for pranks hadn't changed much, and later Fugaku, with a bag of ice to his head and the worst hangover of his life, would be able to tell his wife who had scolded him for suggesting Kushina would spike his wine, I told you so, in an immensely satisfied way, after spending their wedding night too inebriated to consummate their marriage. On the plus side, Kushina's mood improved greatly after this, and when she turned up a few days later on Minato's doorstep with an extra key to her apartment cut especially for him and said, "Why haven't you packed up yet?" so did Minato's. Kushina's house was like something out of a fairy tale. When he'd learnt of its existence, he'd naturally assumed it would be like any teenager's first rented home, on the low end of the market, incredibly cheap with a side of rising damp. And perhaps it had been that way when she'd moved in, but it was clear from the moment he stepped through the door with all his worldly possessions in a box beneath his arm, that Kushina had worked herself to the bone to make this dainty little house the nicest on the street. The first thing that struck him was the smell, a mix between soap and perfume and fresh, sweet flowers. It couldn't have been more obvious that a pair of girls had lived in this house, and he wondered how long after he moved in it would start smelling of old socks and moldy food the way his tent on the border had. Then there was the lightness of the rooms, and soft furniture that, although was cheap, were all so carefully cared for they looked like quality. It was also incredibly tidy. A bowl of flowers sat on the table behind the sofa and ornamental objects lined the bookshelves instead of books. He looked around in faint amazement as Kushina fidgeted behind him, awaiting his approval. Perhaps it was because Kushina had lived for so long without possessions, and certainly without anything nice to call her own, that she took a special pride in this house and all the things in it. For someone on her wages, she must have scrounged and saved every penny, investing almost all of it into her home. Then there was the tiny little garden outside the living room that could only have been made so beautiful with a heavy investment of time and energy, not just money. He looked out the window at the flowerbeds full of color and then back at Kushina. "You like gardening?" he asked. It's my hobby, she said, looking back stolidly like she was daring him to make something of it. This is really nice, he said, which he felt was a bit of an understatement. Nice was something you said about an average house to someone whom you didn't wish to offend. This was picturesque, but he didn't want to be too enthusiastic in case Kushina thought he was pulling her leg. Where's my room? She took him upstairs and pointed it out. This one used to be my room, she said, but Mikoto's had a nicer view so I moved into hers when she left. This is bigger though, so. He looked around the simply furnished room, with its narrow bed beneath a sloping ceiling and skylight window, and he bit his lip. It smelled very strongly of Kushina in here. You can have the other room if you like, Kushina babbled. But I figured, you're a boy, you probably want the space to spread out and do boy stuff. What did she think boys got up to in their rooms? Minato smiled gratefully and said it would do just nicely, and when she suggested he could change anything he liked about the room to make it more comfortable, he jokingly asked if he could paint it pink. Kushina just looked pained. There wasn't much to move in. His clothes left most of his new wardrobe almost as bare as when he'd arrived, and he filled most of the drawers in his rather feminine dresser with weapons and maintenance accessories. The only possessions he'd taken from his old house were his navy blue bed clothes. He just couldn't bear to actually use the flowery print ones Kushina offered, and Mr. Nose in all his noseless glory. Once settled, Kushina laid down the ground rules. Rent was monthly and had to be given to her on time or else he was out. There was to be no loud music after 9 in the evening or he was out. The floorboards of the stairs squeaked loudly whenever anyone used them, so if he ever returned to the house after she'd gone to bed, he would have to climb in through his own bedroom window or else he was out. No putting feet up on the coffee table. Drinks must always be put on coasters. Everything in the top 2 shelves of the fridge was hers, and if she found anything missing he would be out. She would not buy his food, cook his dinner, wash his clothes, or clean his room. He would have to do these things himself, and if she didn't think he was doing an adequate job, he would be out then too. It was a lot to remember. So he figured the general rule was to not touch anything and keep out of her way as much as possible. That was easy enough to do. He rarely ever spent much time at home anyway, always preferring to roam the streets aimlessly instead of returning to his humble abode. A lifetime with his father made habits that were hard to break. If ever he was home, it was just as likely that Kushina was out running her errands or on missions. There was a chalkboard in the kitchen that she used to leave him messages, telling him if she would be gone for a few days, or that if he left the fridge open one more time she would poison him. It was perplexing how one could live with someone and see very little of them. He appreciated that she had her own life and was busy, but he had imagined that by moving in together this would also entail a degree of closeness that he realized wasn't forthcoming. If nothing else, it at least explained why the house was so neat and perfect. Kushina was barely in it. This in turn had its own perks. One time while Kushina was away with her team in the Wave Country, he gave into temptation and snuck into her room. He was really just interested in what a girl's room looked like and the kind of things Kushina would keep in there. As with every other room in the house, it smelled like her, but more strongly than ever, and he took his time leisurely looking over the objects on her dresser: nail polish, makeup remover, moisturizer, and something called hair lacquer. It seemed it took an awful lot of effort and scientific research to keep Kushina looking subtly glamorous, and even then he thought this was probably pretty modest for a girl's cosmetic collection. Her desk was more sensible, holding weighty volumes of nature manipulation theory and gardening, and a collection of pens and scissors. There was a diary in one drawer, but he didn't touch it. He was only interested in understanding her realm and interests, not her most intimate thoughts. Besides, if he read it he knew he would only be upset if he found anything unflattering about himself in there. Looking through her other drawers he found her old high-tie with the Whirlpool insignia, the one he'd had fixed to a new ribbon for her graduation. Although she no longer wore it, she still apparently kept it clean and in its own drawer, so it still meant a lot to her. He steered clear of her underwear drawer after he stumbled across it, another matter of intense privacy he had no right to, though he took his time looking at the clothes in her closet. She'd once worn androgynous sweaters and threadbare shorts, but her wardrobe now looked typical of a teenage girl. She had the obligatory Chunin uniform that he'd never seen her wear. She seemed to prefer wearing her leggings with a snug, blue tunic over a long-sleeved shirt, foregoing the standard-issue vest and sandals, and many more casual clothes, including several skirts and even a dress. Minato wondered if he'd ever get to see her in a dress. Before leaving, he made sure to lift the sleeve one of her shirts to his nose and inhale that unique smell that was a mix of washing powder and perfume. He was always worried that by living with her, his nose would simply stop smelling this delightful smell one day, and then where would he be? And it was during one of these occasions when Kushina was away, and Minato was nearing the end of his psychological assessment, that a fateful knock struck against their shared door. Minato opened it curiously to find a dark-haired stranger standing on the doorstep, wearing the uniform and markings of a jonin. "Oh," the stranger said when he saw Minato, looking unsure and dismayed. "I thought this was Uzumaki Kushina's house." "It is," Minato answered. "If you're looking for her, she's out on a mission right now, though she should be back in a couple of days." "I see." The stranger looked even more crestfallen. He also looked surprisingly familiar. Kushina's front door held a spectacular view of the Hokage monument, and when Minato glanced over the man's shoulder to look at the third face emerging from the cliffs, suddenly he knew who this man resembled. "Sorry," he said, "but is your name Sarutobi, by any chance?" "Yes," said Sarutobi, looking surprised. "Sarutobi Run. Kushina's mentioned me?" Actually, it was more like everyone but Kushina had mentioned him. "Yeah. And you must be." Sarutobi narrowed his eyes as he looked over Minato's blonde hair and blue eyes. "Namikaze Minato, isn't it?" When Minato nodded he looked relieved. "Oh, Kushina's told me all about you too, and of course, I've heard about you and your victory over one of the swordsmen of the mist. It's an honor to finally meet you." "Likewise," Minato said mildly, for he was busy measuring Sarutobi discreetly from head to toe. He was as tall as Minato had imagined, and had the same kind, open face that the Hokage possessed. Sort of handsome, but on the soft and vague side, though his thick black hair and dark eyes made him distinctive where he could have been ordinary. It was the kind of face Minato liked, and it was the kind of face that held a deceptive appeal to girls. Minato could easily imagine Kushina falling for such a person out on the front lines. "I had no idea you were living together though," said Sarutobi, glancing past him uncertainly. "I thought she was living with Uchiha Mikoto." "She was. Mikoto got married, so Kushina's renting the spare room to me out of the kindness of her heart," Minato said quickly. "That's all." "Oh, good." Sarutobi's relief was almost comical for how obvious it was. "For a moment there I thought, well, never mind. It was nice to meet you. When Kushina returns, please tell her I came by." Sarutobi made a gesture that was halfway between a wave and a salute and began to step away from the door. Minato was not done with him yet, however. "I was wondering if you could tell me something," he said, before the other man could escape. Sure." Sarutobi quizzically tilted his head. It was quite startling, because it was exactly what Kushina had started doing. Now who had copied whom? "How old are you?" The man was beginning to look worried. 25. Why? That was far too old. But then maybe Kushina liked mature men? Okay. "It was nice to meet you." The door slammed shut. It was with a heart-lifting relief that Minato took his final mental health assessment. Not even the unblinking woman could get him down, nor her impertinent questions about his relationship with his father or the less than subtle questions like, "Do you feel like snapping and killing everyone around you? From time to time?" An end to his assessments meant a new beginning to his career. And hints had been dropped like clangers by his superiors that he was due for a promotion, and sure enough, when the results of his assessment came out with the conclusion that he was about as sane as anyone could expect for a shinobi, which wasn't much, he received a message to attend to the Hokage immediately. Minato had been dreading this moment a little, not half because the Hokage was still an intimidating figure who seemed to expect more of him than anyone else he'd ever known. At least, he thought as he entered the man's office, the Hokage wasn't as tall as he remembered. Now when they stood, they were almost eye to eye, although the first thing Minato did was sink to one knee and bow his head, for a lowly Chunin did not greet the leader of a hidden village without a little kowtowing. "Please rise, my dear boy," the Hokage said, waggling his pipe at Minato. "I've been hearing many great things about you." Although he'd obviously been hearing a lot about his questionable sanity too, to have pounced no sooner was he given the all-clear. "Taking down one of the 7 swordsmen is something even I'd think twice about doing myself," the Hokage confided to him, though everyone knew if the Hokage had gotten it into his head to go after General Akuz, said general would have fled at the sight of him. "I think it's safe to say we have a special young man on our hands. I've had some recommendations from the other jonin, including Commander Danzu, that you may be ready for promotion. How do you feel about that?" It was like being back with the unblinking woman. How did he feel? Minato struggled for an answer, for he wasn't in the business of categorizing how any one thing made him feel, except obvious things, like how chocolate-coated breakfast cereal made him feel sick. "Honored," he said, after a briefly panicked pause. "Although, I'm surprised the commander has such high opinions of me." "Well, let's not get too carried away. He recommends promotion, but he also insists you have a problem with authority and arrogance. It could have been worse. He could have recommended execution, which would have reflected Danzu's real feelings towards Minato more accurately. Calling him an arrogant renegade was pretty tame compared to some of the things Danzu had done, and Minato wondered if he should tell the Hokage that his commander was a little dangerous. Except, he most likely already knew that, and what proof did Minato have that Danzu had tried to kill him anyway? "Do you think you have a problem with authority, Minato?" the Hokage asked wonderingly. "Only, with Commander Danzu's authority," Minato hedged uncertainly. "Possibly." "Ah, well that proves it." The Hokage clapped his freckled hands together. "How could I not offer a promotion now?" "Thank you, sir." Minato bowed his head again, blushing a little. "My nephew, Run, is waiting for you outside," the Hokage informed him. "I believe you've already met. He'll show you the ropes and explain what's expected of you, and the official ceremony for your induction will be held in 2 days." Minato flinched a little. Could that be postponed a little?" "Why, you have something better to do than accept this very gracious offer." The Hokage fixed a stare at him over the puffs of smoke rising from the pipe in his mouth. Minato colored all over again. He'd only hoped to delay the ceremony a few more days so that Kushina could attend. She would still be on her mission for another 3 days. But one did not make the Hokage rearrange his schedule to accommodate the whims of a lowly Chunin, soon to be a slightly slowly Jonin. "Of course not, sir," he said meekly. Good. The Hokage sank back into his amicable facade of a harmless old man. "Off with you." So the second time Minato met with Kushina Sarutobi, it was much less of a shock to both of them. As promised, he was shown the ropes, which included a tour of the Jonin headquarters and an introduction to most of the other Jonin, and the special Jonin privileged vending machines. Sarutobi imparted his wisdom and experience with precise brevity and enthusiasm, and it was easy to see that he'd been an excellent captain out in the field. He loved his job. When his tour slipped into anecdotes, Minato was particularly impressed with one story about how he'd managed to confuse the waterfall enemy in their own terrain by literally modifying the landscape with some earthjutsu that had taken the cooperation of 10 ninja to pull off. There was now apparently one small edge of the border where the waterfalls suddenly disappeared and the land turned into a jagged array of pits and cliffs and gargantuan spikes. Kushina wasn't very happy, of course, Sarutobi said. Said something about destroying the natural beauty of the landscape. Natural gardener, that girl. Something her captain had apparently learned before Minato. A little soft-hearted, he guessed. She can be a little sentimental sometimes, Sarutobi admitted lightly. This reminded Minato of another question that had been bothering him for quite some time. I was wondering if you could tell me something. Sure. I heard a lot of rumors about Kushina in Waterfall, but she doesn't like to talk about it much. I was just wondering, is it true? The Jonin seemed to understand immediately what he was driving at. About the Angel of Mercy stuff? Sarutobi shrugged. Yeah, I guess. It was pretty extraordinary. Of course, Minato was already sure it was true. What he was really interested in was hearing what Saru thought of it. She didn't get disciplined? Sarutobi gave a faint grimace. Probably should have, but it's like kicking a puppy. She suffered enough at the hands of the others without me formally cutting her down. Besides, I'm not convinced she was wrong. Hell, I started to let the bastards go myself after a while, and maybe she was right? Mercy is just as good at winning a war as cruelty. The peace talks were pretty quick, after all, 'cause people tend to believe you don't plan to annex their country more easily if you let their soldiers return unharmed. Minato nodded, contemplating this quietly. If Kushina had managed to influence her own superiors, that was pretty impressive. If the Jonin nephew of the Hokage believed Mercy had aided the war effort, that had to mean something, and not just that he had a spectacular crush on the girl in question. It all left Minato in a very uncertain position, however. He'd killed so many because he'd thought it necessary. What if it hadn't been? It's normal to be subjected to a little hazing when you enter the fold, so watch out for that, Sarutobi went on blithely. But they might make an exception for you, of course. You're probably the first Chunin to become a legend before you became a Jonin, after all. Great, Minato intoned. They stopped at the base of the building, and since Sarutobi had led him here, this probably meant an end to his induction. That's all of the important stuff, he said to Minato. It all becomes official in the ceremony, so I'll look forward to you joining us then. Thanks. Is Kushina back in town yet? Sarutobi asked with indiscreet hopefulness. Not that I know of, Minato said honestly. I'll tell her you asked when she gets back. I'm sure she's just as eager to catch up with you too. Sarutobi looked a little blank at this, and Minato wondered what he'd said wrong. Did Kushina really tell you about me? He asked. Minato schooled his expression. It wasn't like he'd lied and said Kushina spoke of him constantly, but he still felt a little deceitful. Well, not much, you know how private she is. Since you're her friend, I guess I can tell you what happened between us, Sarutobi said. Then when you see her, maybe you can talk to her for me. A tiny and sorely exercised muscle contracted between Minato's eyebrows, creating something akin to a frown. What happened? He demanded. And Sarutobi took a deep breath. The streets were quiet when Minato made his way home a few nights later, punctuated only occasionally by the odd congratulations from strangers who recognized him, or "You've done your mother proud." That was nice of them, he thought, always disorientated how people could speak to them as if they knew him personally when he had never met them, or had else forgotten them. The latter was always a possibility. Kushina was very critical of his tendency to forget faces. But now he was the youngest Jonin ever. Already feared throughout the 5 nations. Short of becoming a Kage, this was the highest rank any ninja could obtain, and he supposed there was some lofty satisfaction in his new title. Yet the hole that had opened inside him since leaving the border, leaving the war, would not be satisfied by this much. He was a jonin in peacetime. What was the point of that? He would feel better after going on some A-class or S-class mission, he reassured himself. For the past few weeks he'd been lacking appropriate stimulation, like an energetic dog locked up inside a house without even a game of Scrabble to engage him. Now that the official ceremony was out of the way, he could finally get back to his purpose. In the deepening dusk that crept through the village like a long shadow, Minato turned down the street where he lived and saw a light on in the house he shared with Kushina. Since she always scolded him magnificently if he wasted electricity, Minato was very conscientious about turning off lights before he left home, which could only mean one of two things: he'd made a mistake, which was very unlikely, or Kushina had returned. Suddenly he was walking faster, as if the energy that had slowly been sapped from him all day returned in a rush. The key clicked in the lock as he entered, and the most delicious smell hit him like a wave of heat. Kushina heard the door slam shut and poked her head out the kitchen. "Oh. You're back," she said, and he noticed she was wearing an apron dusted with white powder. "You cooking?" he guessed. Kushina's response was to disappear again. "Did you have a nice mission?" he asked instead, heading towards the light of the kitchen. He didn't know what else to say. "Hi. How are you doing? I'm a jonin now, by the way." He looked through the door to see Kushina bent over the table. "Don't look," she cried. "It's not ready yet." "What the, cover your eyes." It must have been some sort of unspeakable horror. Minato obediently clapped his hands over his eyes and promptly bumped into the doorframe. "What's going on?" "You can't look," Kushina said, making a terrific noise as she tore around the kitchen. "It's a surprise." "The good kind?" He didn't really want to be on the receiving end of one of her pranks. Word had it that Uchiha Fugeface was still the butt of a lot of unflattering jokes. "You'll find out," Kushina said, and he felt her flowery hands grab his elbows in order to steer him across the floor. "Have a seat, but don't peek or I'll kill you." Ninja took death threats seriously, so Minato resisted the temptation to look through the cracks between his fingers. That delicious, sweet smell was strongest here, making his dry mouth water a little after a long day of eating nothing except for a bowl of boiled rice and vegetables from the cheapest booth in the market. After a full suspenseful minute, wherein he could hear Kushina moving about at breakneck speed, he finally sensed her falling into the chair beside his. "Okay, you can open your eyes now." Minato dropped his hands and looked. In the middle of the table sat a plate, and upon this plate sat the pinkest cake he'd ever seen, trimmed with what he assumed was edible glitter and little red stars and sprinkles. Across the middle the word jonin was spelled out in cream that was only slightly smudged on the last letter. He looked at Kushina. "Is this for me?" He couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. "Duh." She stared at him, ever so slightly anxious, awaiting his real reaction. "I'm sorry I couldn't make it back in time for your ceremony. It had already started when I arrived and they wouldn't let me in, Uchiha police on the door, so it figures, and I was so annoyed I came back here and made a cake." "Do you often make cakes when you're annoyed?" he wondered. "No, this is a present," she sighed. "To say I'm sorry I missed everything and, well, congratulations." This caught Minato a little off guard. He'd been convinced that he would be the one forced to apologize when she returned, for having not invited her to his ceremony, and yet here she was with a cake of apology. "Why the pink?" he asked. "You said you liked pink." She frowned. "Don't you like it?" "I love it." Oh, how such small flippant lies came round to bit him. "Can I have a piece?" "Duh," she said again, though more kindly. "It's your cake, dummy." And though it might not have looked like much, with its smudged dressing and homage to the pink spectrum, when Minato took his first cautious bite into the soft, moist sponge, taste buds he never knew had existed before sang out in joy. "Huh," he said, looking from the slice in his hand to the rest of the cake still on the table. "Relax," he warned. There was still plenty left. Except with every bite there would be less and less, and this cake was a once-in-a-lifetime event. He needed to savor every crumb. Kushina had very strict rules about self-sufficiency. She would undoubtedly never cook for him again, let alone bake a cake as delicious and saintly as this one. What? Kushina looked worried. Is it too sweet? Oh, or maybe I think I dropped some eggshell, though it was only a little bit. Kushina, this cake is the best thing I've ever tasted, Minato said, perfectly serious. As always, Kushina looked suspicious. She never trusted compliments. Don't be silly. No, really. Though he was loath to forfeit even a tiny scrap, Kushina needed to understand her ungodly talent. He broke off the corner of his cake slice and offered it to her. Cautiously, Kushina accepted it. She chewed like a food critic, slowly and with a judgmental frown. It's okay, she concluded. Not bad for a first attempt. This is your first cake? When she nodded, he decided then and there that she had to be some kind of prodigy. If I pay you, will you make one of these for me every week? Would you just shut up and eat it? She laughed, blushing slightly. Weirdo. She couldn't possibly stop him. Minato pushed the rest of the slice into his mouth and reached for a second. His gluttony was evidently more trustworthy than his words, and Kushina looked pleased as he helped himself to more. So, you're a jonin now. How does that feel? He shrugged, mouth full. Discussions about feelings had happily ended with the mental health assessments. You'll be getting all the big missions now, huh? She drew a short nail in a loose circle on the tablecloth. Promise you'll be careful, okay? He smiled, glitter covering his chin. You know me. Can't be any more dangerous than the war, I guess, she sighed, propping her chin in her palm. But it seems like only yesterday you were standing there in the stadium, getting stabbed by that rain country assassin. I thought it was such a massive overreaction at the time. You were just as much a squirt as everyone else, even if you were ridiculously fast. But I can see why they were all scared then. Today, you'd make assassins like that wet themselves to think of taking you on. Ah. He said around a mouthful of the best cake on earth. Kushina reached out absently and flicked a crumb off his cheek. But you're not invulnerable, Minato, so just, be careful, okay? I'm always careful, he promised. You can't let your guard down, even for a minute, she said, raising her finger. Not even in this village. Oh, come on, Konoha's pretty safe, he tried to remind her. There's plenty of creeps in Konoha too. He nodded sagely. You mean Inoichi? Inoichi is a sexual harassment fine waiting to happen, she said, but he's harmless. I'm talking about real freaks, Minato. Did you know people have been going missing from the village? A baby disappeared about a month ago and no one knows what happened. And they weren't just civilians, they were ninja like us. Weird, he hummed, eyeing the knife and entertaining the possibility of a third slice. So don't forget to lock all the doors and windows at night, she said. You never know who's out there. Yes. Can I? Oh, go on. She passed him the knife, feigning exasperation, though in truth she looked smug. I never knew you liked cake so much. Neither did I, he said earnestly. He had never had much of a sweet tooth, but this hit all the right notes in his palate. I bet Sarutobi would like some of this. The secret smile dropped from Kushina's face. What? Sarutobi. He looked up at her. He's back, you know, turned up on the doorstep looking for you and pretty disappointed that you weren't in. You met him? Kushina asked cautiously. Yef, he said around his cake. Fori, did you talk? Minato swallowed hastily. Nah, he said, noting her relieved expression. Although we did talk later when he was showing me around the Jonin headquarters. He's really nice. Very friendly. Sounds like a good captain to have out in the field. Kushina leveled him an even stare. He is, she said coolly. He asked after you quite a lot, Minato mentioned, and she looked away from him. Seems a little anxious to get in touch, actually. Things didn't end so well between you two or something? A deep scowl had settled on Kushina's face, and if she wasn't careful, her beautiful skin would be creased and crinkled prematurely with such abuse. What did he tell you? Nothing, Minato lied flawlessly. But I'm not an idiot. You said you were good friends, but it doesn't seem that way from where I'm sitting. Kushina chewed her cheek angrily. What happened? He asked. Even if he'd already heard it from Sarutobi, he knew that the one who needed to say it was Kushina herself. I think my sheets are done in the dryer. I should really go put them on my bed before I get too tired, Kushina said, beginning to get up. Minato hooked his foot beneath the spoke of her chair and tugged it forward just enough to gently tumble her back into the seat. Her mouth dropped indignantly, ready to tear him a new one. Please tell me. He widened his eyes and tilted his eyebrows up, which was unconsciously becoming, especially with all that icing around his mouth. Kushina's resolve visibly wavered as she searched his face, then dropped her hands glumly into her lap. Will you stop bothering me about him if I tell you? She asked. Absolutely, he swore. Well, you know we were stationed on the border together, she began slowly. I was in his unit and he was my captain. Yes, Minato said, slightly impatiently. We got on really well. He helped out a lot with Sensei, you know. He was the one who pulled some strings back home to make sure there was always someone to check on him since I was away. And well, we got close. Minato nodded, waiting for her to gather the courage to continue. Then, one day, she said, with great effort, he asked me to go out with him. Minato nodded again and waited. And then, Kushina's eyes flashed up to meet his. What do you mean, and then? He asked me to go out with him, she cried out. You said no, he surmised. What was I supposed to do, she demanded. Where the hell is one supposed to go out to, in the middle of a battlefield? How could he do that to me? We were getting along just fine, and then he had to go and ruin everything like that. I could hardly look at him after that. I was glad to be sent home. It was exactly as Sarutobi had said, but Minato was still baffled. Don't you like him? He asked. I like him fine, she blustered. But not enough to date him. Well, she blushed heavily, wringing her hands into interesting contortions. Don't think I'm ready for that kind of stuff. Why couldn't we have just stayed friends? Why go and make things all awkward like that? He sighed and reached for the knife in order to offer her the fourth piece of a cake which now only read Joe. Kushina accepted it gratefully and stuffed it into her mouth, chewing violently in her misery. Sarutobi's a really nice guy, Kushina, he said, now that her mouth was occupied. He's a jonin and a nephew of the Hokage, most people would consider him a real catch. And he hardly talks about anything but you. Maybe you should give him a chance. She managed to swallow. He's even older than Fugueface, she complained. You can't tell, he promised. And why would he ask someone like me out anyway, she demanded. There were loads of prettier girls in our unit alone. Why? Because you're kind and smart and you're just as pretty as the prettier girls, he said. You're quite a good catch yourself. I don't see anyone knocking down the door to ask me out, she said bitterly. Well, you're also kinda scary, he admitted. But Sarutobi has obviously overlooked that, so what are you waiting for? She fidgeted and diverted her gaze again. He's probably going to ask you again the next time he sees you, Minato said with some certainty, after all he'd told Sarutobi himself not to give up. So you might as well give it a go and see what it's like. If you don't like it, big deal, you can go home knowing you at least tried. But, you shouldn't run from these things. It's just a waste of a good friendship otherwise, and you never know, you might be missing something really good if you turn your back on him now. Says you, she shot back accusingly. I don't see you throwing yourself into any serious relationships, and I bet you have girls asking you out all the time. Not really. He'd honestly been approached very little by the fairer sex, the more formidable his reputation seemed to grow. It was like they just sort of gave up hope after a while. Besides, I already have a girlfriend. Kushina's jaw dropped. Since when? She cried. She's still on the border of the water country, explained Minato. She's called Yoshi. You've never mentioned her, she said quietly, sounding like he'd winded her cruelly. Then she gave herself a shake. If she's anything like Kagura, you can keep her to yourself. Will you give Sarutobi a chance? He pressed. Don't pester me. I'll think about it, she said, which was another way of avoiding the answer. It was hard to say how closely to heart Kushina had taken his words that night. He knew at least that she had yet to seek Sarutobi out, though she didn't seem to be deliberately avoiding him. She went about her regular daily routines, and when Minato went to the Jonin headquarters, Sarutobi the younger could be seen distinctly moping around the corridors like the miserable monkey he was. Every time he looked hopefully at Minato, Minato could only shrug. Hopelessly. It was up to Kushina to accept him, and there was only so much he would urge his friend towards a relationship she didn't want. Retrospectively, however, Minato was quite glad he'd mentioned Yoshi to Kushina that night, or else it would have been quite the shock when she turned up a few days later with an impassioned cry of "my love," and thrown herself into Minato's arms in full view of about 400 shoppers and Kushina herself. Instead of keeping an eye on the deployment rotary to see who was coming back from the front lines this month, Minato had been busy waiting for a suitable class assignment to come up. That was his job now, after all, to look out for interesting missions and then form a team to accomplish them. Usually Jonin took their old teams out, which in Minato's case meant AI and Saburo, but he was pretty sure the purpose of taking familiar teammates would be defeated in this case, if his familiar teammates hated him. Saburo might have liked him, though it was hard to say since he still didn't say anything. Perhaps he would be better off forming a new team of Chunin? There were plenty of people to choose from, like Chi-Chi. She was enormously useful with weaponry. He could even take Kushina. But such thoughts were swept from his mind that morning, when he was once again shadowing Kushina to the library, swept by the uncontrollable blonde whirlwind that was his alleged girlfriend, Yoshi. There you are, she squealed, arms clamped around his neck like a drowning woman. Oh, I've missed you so much. You have no idea how boring and lonely it got out there without you. Hello, Yoshi, he greeted, recalling that he actually knew next to nothing about this girl. And you're a Jonin now too, she gasped, her voice throbbing with admiration. I don't believe it, you're so awesome. Is this your girlfriend? Kushina asked. She sounded almost hopeful, perhaps because she would be thoroughly disgusted if this was how everyone was expected to behave around him now. It would be a cold day in hell when Kushina greeted him as warmly as this. Kushina, this is Yoshi, Minato said, introducing the scowling girl to the one hanging from his neck. Yoshi, this is Kushina. Kushina, that's such a pretty name, Yoshi breathed, and it was a good thing she instantly whipped back to Minato, for it looked as if Kushina was opening her mouth to give a sneering retort. You're not busy, are you, Minato? I was so hoping we could hang out together. Sure. Minato looked at Kushina to check it was all right, but it wasn't like she'd invited him along to the library anyway, he'd invited himself. I'll catch you later, Kushina. Bye, Kushina. Yoshi gave her a perfect 100-watt smile. Nothing about it rang as particularly disingenuous, other than that everything Yoshi said and did rang a little fake and forced, and Kushina looked back at her even more coolly. You two look very cute together, she said, although by the tone of her voice alone she may well have just spat on them. Yoshi, oblivious to any awkwardness, looped her arm thought Minato's and wheeled him away. She planned to parade him on her arm through as many busy streets as possible and past the houses of her friends who had laughed when she'd told them the yellow flash was her boyfriend. He was her quintessential trophy. Of course, that didn't mean Yoshi was not in love. It was a fact that she had never been so smitten with anyone in her life, and not only was she planning their wedding, she was picking out names for their children and planning their weddings too. It was also a fact that Minato could not remember Yoshi's last name, nor much of the time they'd spent together. As long as she didn't quiz him, he felt they would get along anyway. There were worse people to lean against his side, and stroke his hair, and kiss his cheek than a pretty blonde girl with the widest smile in the village and matching dimples. And if Yoshi noticed that he never stroked her hair, or kissed her cheek, she didn't show it. That evening, he retired home more fatigued than if he'd been battling Mist-Nin for 10 straight hours. If he'd ever thought he didn't know Yoshi well at the beginning of the day, he'd been soundly divested of all ignorance by the time the sun set. By then he knew the names of every single one of her grandparents and her menagerie of pets that included, but was not limited to 7 guinea pigs, 5 dogs, 25 canaries, 3 prize-winning hawks, a tank of uncountable stick insects, and 1 terrapin who may or may not have died some years ago, since no one was willing to wade through the impenetrably murky pond water to see if it was still there. So naturally, when Minato made it to the quiet solitude of the house he shared with Kushina, he heaved a zen sigh of relief and slunk to stretch out on the sofa and watch some mindless TV on mute. He hadn't missed television entertainment on the border, but now that he had it back, he felt somewhat honor-bound to observe it for a few hours every day, to keep up with the world if nothing else. The lock of the front door clicked at midnight, signaling that Kushina was home. Minato levered himself up to peer over the back of the sofa at the girl standing in the hall, placing her flat pumps meticulously on the shoe rack. "Nice day?" he asked. "Have a nice time with Yoshi?" she asked in response. Her tone was about as dull as his own. "Yeah, it's alright," he said with a shrug. He had no strong feelings about it one way or the other. Kushina looked up at him through the strands of crimson hair that had escaped her bun. Her mouth was pressed in a thin line. "Annoyed? Or hungry?" "I left the last piece of the cake for you," he said, very generously. "It's your cake," she shot back, then she added more virtuously, "and I'm on a diet." The stack of chocolate bars under her bed begged to differ. "Okay," he said. All the more for him, he supposed. Kushina thumped into the living room. "What are you watching?" "Dunno." This was apparently a fascinating show, so Kushina decided to watch it with him. "Budge over," he said, tapping the legs occupying her end of the suite. She was only just beginning to sit down when there was a knock at the door. Both Kushina and Minato looked at one another, stunned. They rarely got visitors, least of all at midnight, and it wasn't until the second knock that either of them reacted. "Burglars," Kushina said at once, demonstrating she was nothing if not paranoid. "Maybe it's something to do with work?" Minato said, a little more rationally. "Burglars don't knock. Sometimes they do, to make sure no one's in before they break the window," she whispered. "Better go answer it then," he said. Kushina slid across the dark room and back into the hall. There was a formidably shaped shadow looming against the small pane of frosted glass in the door, and Kushina crouched down to flip up the letterbox and peer out at their late-night visitor. Whoever it was made her gasp and leap back, staring at the door in frozen horror. "Burglars?" he hissed, growing worried now. She shook her head. "Much worse," she whispered fearfully. "Hello?" said the stranger outside. "Kushina? Minato? Is that you?" That sounded an awful lot like Sarutobi. "Aren't you going to answer it?" he asked Kushina, who flapped her hands angrily at him and pressed a finger to her lips pointedly. Minato rolled his eyes. "He already heard you opening the letterbox, there's no point pretending we're not in." "Then you answer it. Tell him I'm not in." Kushina whispered, retreating for the stairs. Minato flopped back onto the sofa. No, he said plainly. He wants to speak to you, not me. Minato, she gasped at him, hurt by his betrayal. Right then, however, Minato was doing a good impression of not existing, abandoning Kushina to her fate. Given the choice of running upstairs and hiding beneath her bed with her chocolate, and confronting her former captain, it seemed Kushina was torn. He knew she wasn't a coward, although she certainly took several long seconds to scrape her courage together and reach forward to open the door. "Saru," she exclaimed, as if surprised to see him. "Kushina." Sarutobi returned, "To hope it's not too late, only I didn't see you get back till just a few minutes ago." "Were you staking out the house?" Kushina asked uncertainly. "All day, yes," Sarutobi nodded. "I didn't know how else to find you." Credit where credit was due, he had to be a damn good ninja if Minato hadn't been able to sense him moping about out there. However, Kushina just looked worried. "What was so important that you needed to stalk my house?" she asked, as if dreading the answer. Sarutobi sighed, perhaps already sensing his imminent defeat. "I know things have been awkward between us since I spoke up at the border. I was hoping that at least things would return to normal between us, but I think it's safe to say that's not going to happen. And I can't stop thinking about you. It hurts me, Kushina, it actually physically hurts in my chest to think I've ruined everything." This made vastly more compelling viewing than any soap opera on the TV set. Minato's act of non-existence was paying off rather well, as he doubted Sarutobi would say such impassioned things if he knew there was an audience. Kushina knew though, and she kept shooting the sofa nervous looks as she tried to placate her captain. "Don't misunderstand, Saru, I consider you one of my greatest friends. But you avoid me," he all but whimpered. "Not intentionally," she lied outrageously. "I don't understand, Kushina," Sarutobi shook his head, "I thought we were getting along really well. I thought you liked me." "I do like you. I've never met another girl like you, Kushina, and I don't think I ever will. There is no one as kind as you, or as intelligent, or funny, or adorable as you. You made me open my eyes. When I imagine life without you, it's like imagining life without the sun or the moon." Minato thought he was overdoing it a bit. So did Kushina. "Steady on, run," she mumbled. "Do you understand how much you mean to me?" Sarutobi asked, reaching out to grasp her hands in his. Minato quite enjoyed the way Kushina stared at their joined limbs, like the concept of handholding was entirely new to her. "I may be wasting my time here, but even if you cannot love me, at least be my friend. I need you in my life, even if you don't want to be with me." "Two don't know." Kushina stammered. "Isn't that really awkward? I'm not sure I can just pretend to be friends with someone who loves me. It seems cruel to do that to you." "Well, maybe you can give me a chance," he asked. "Give us a chance? I don't want to force you to do anything, but if you open yourself to the possibilities, would it be too much to hope you'll find a place in your heart for me in time?" "Run, I don't not like you. I mean," Kushina screwed up her face. "I do like you. But not that way." He nodded sadly, loosening his fingers to drop her hands. "No," she shook her head sharply again, refusing to let go. "I like you. I really like you a lot actually. Kushina." He sighed. Sarutobi's expression was like that of a man who was witnessing the descent of an angel from heaven. "To just feel scared," she admitted. "I don't know how to be a girlfriend." "We don't have to do anything serious," he pleaded. "Just come to some movies with me. I'll take you to a club. We can go dancing. And singing. All I want is your company, Kushina, nothing more. I would die a happy man if I had nothing more than the honor of holding your hand." Even Minato was feeling a little taken with Sarutobi, so it was no wonder that Kushina was staring at him, pink-cheeked and moist-eyed. "We can do those things," she whispered. just not the singing. You'll want to throw me out a window if you hear me sing." Sarutobi laughed, and it was a beautiful moment. The ice was breaking and Kushina was stepping up bravely to the possibility of love, just as Minato had hoped. Only the god Cupid could have known how he felt at that moment, in the pleasure in architecting a sweet and just romance between two worthy people. Minato decided he could add matchmaker to his list of talents now, even though many would point out he had only given these two the lightest of nudges. They had done most of the work. "So you'll be my girlfriend?" Sarutobi breathed. Kushina, speechless at her own audacity, nodded mutely. "Thank you," Sarutobi whispered. "Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you." He leaned forward and pressed a heartfelt kiss on Kushina's cheek while Minato smiled on beatifically. Then, Sarutobi slowed, the victorious smile softening as he looked into Kushina's eyes, his face close to hers. They were going to kiss, Minato realized, and slowly but surely they did, with only the slightest hesitant jerk backwards from Kushina before their lips touched chastely. And as Minato looked on at the scene of his own doing, at the sight of young, earnest love beginning to bud, the smile began to fade from his face. Though he didn't understand why, suddenly all he felt like doing was kicking Sarutobi in the face. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Guys, make sure to help the author by visiting the link in the description. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off.